In a lavish, gold-plated hotel lobby like this, how could there be someone so filthy? Officer Grant growled. You were born to scrub floors. Don't even dream of lifting your head. No one expected Naomi Brooks to pick up the phone and fire off a stream of flawless Dutch that brought the entire room to a standstill. Victor Delaunay, the cold-eyed millionaire sitting nearby, suddenly stood up. Everyone out. I want to speak with her alone. This wasn't just a humiliating blow to the bigots. It was a reminder. Talent has no color, and sometimes justice begins with a voice that refuses to shrink. Naomi Brooks moved slowly between long tables draped in crisp white linen, the golden glow of the chandeliers catching every speck of dust on the glass surfaces she carefully wiped clean. The hotel's conference hall was a gathering place for the powerful, where leather shoes echoed on marble floors and casual conversations floated around million-dollar deals. In this setting, the presence of a black cleaning woman like Naomi was always treated as background noise, existing only to make the space shine, rarely acknowledged as a human being. She did the job with dedication, not for praise, but out of respect for her own labor. Every wipe was steady and deliberate, reflecting the patience life had drilled into her over the years. The heavy doors swung open and the footsteps echoed louder than usual. Officer Grant entered with 2 security staff, carrying the swagger of those used to standing over others. His eyes swept the room and landed on Naomi. Rather than seeing someone at work, he looked at her like she didn't belong. His voice rang out, cold and deliberate, designed to be heard across the room. Black folks belong in dirty places, not standing in this room. The words sliced through the air like a blade, silencing every whisper in an instant. For several seconds, the conference lobby was dead silent. Not out of respect, complicity. The other staff members, dressed in the same uniform as Naomi, avoided her eyes and tried to hide their smirks. A few didn't bother. One wiped a wine glass and snorted softly. Another whispered something that made a third giggle, as if watching someone be humiliated was their personal entertainment. No one stepped in to stop the insult. In their eyes, Naomi was from the bottom rung, easy to mock without consequence. Naomi kept her hand on the cloth, paused briefly, then continued wiping the table. Outwardly, she looked untouched, but in her chest, her heartbeat grew heavier. Her breath caught for a moment before she steadied it again. She wouldn't let herself react the way they hoped. She knew one wrong glance or word could be twisted into an excuse to drag her lower, so she chose silence. Not the silence of surrender, but the silence of someone who had lived too long in spaces shadowed by prejudice. Meanwhile, Victor Delaunay sat back in a leather chair placed at the center of the room, holding a financial newspaper. A millionaire familiar to the elite, Victor was someone everyone in the hotel treated with caution. When Officer Grant's insult rang out, Victor didn't lift his head. His eyes stayed on the page, his lips curving into the faintest smile. It wasn't clear enough to be approved, but not firm enough to be disapproved. It felt like a silent nod of permission, a quiet admission that the humiliation could happen and he wouldn't interfere. Naomi glanced briefly toward the corner of the room where Victor sat. He didn't look back, seemingly detached, but Naomi noticed one thing. In a room full of people, his silence carried more weight than any spoken word. He said nothing, made no move, but that indifference was a quiet ally to the ones who insulted her. It gave Grant's words more weight, as if stamped with power's approval. Grant picked up on it, emboldened by the lack of resistance. He stood firm, voice loud and clear, speaking with the arrogance of someone who believed he was stating a fact. She thinks wiping tables in here makes her a lady? Look around. No one here looks like her. A few mocking laughs echoed. A small chorus, faint but sharp enough to create a wave of collective pressure. Naomi lowered her head further and wiped a clean, hard stroke across the glossy table surface, the cloth spinning as if she were engraving her silence into the polished wood. The air in the lobby grew heavier, not just from the insult, but from the stark truth that no one planned to stop it. A room full of power, staff, police officers, and a wealthy millionaire, yet not a single voice rose in objection. Naomi stood alone in the storm of prejudice, and it wasn't the first storm she had faced, but this time felt different. In the flicker of Victor's condescending glance, in the curl of his lip, Naomi sensed something beyond apathy. Maybe he was watching more than he let on, and that only made the tension tighter. In that moment, Naomi understood one thing. The prejudice in this room had passed the point of mockery. It had become a declaration, a statement that she did not belong. And just as the feeling of being pushed to the margins crystallized in her mind, she tightened her grip on the cloth, tilted her head slightly, and turned her eyes toward the glow from the chandelier above. No one noticed that instant, but inside Naomi, a small fire had been lit, waiting for the right moment to burn, and that moment was drawing closer than ever. The sound of a cane striking the marble floor echoed dry and sharp, each tap slicing through the air like a claim to authority. Officer Doyle blocked the narrow passage where Naomi Brooks stood holding a cleaning cloth, his feet planted wide, taking up all the space, his gaze deliberately aimed downward, where Naomi kept her head low as she worked. He smiled slowly, a grin stretched across the face of someone used to control, then spoke with a voice like a blade. "Ever look in a mirror? This $1,000,000 hotel doesn't need cheap blood." The words cheap blood rang out heavy, pressing down as if meant to crush Naomi to the floor. His voice carried across the large room where banquet tables were being prepped for a major meeting, now frozen in silence. Other staff dropped their gaze. Some curled their lips in cruel amusement, too afraid to laugh out loud, but their eyes made Naomi the center of shared shame. Doyle knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted the silence of the room to side with him, to let every stifled chuckle cut deeper into the woman still standing. Naomi froze, her hand gripping the cloth as if it could anchor her. She drew a breath, lifted her gaze for a second, a flash of defiance flickering before dropping it again when Doyle tilted his head. Her silence wasn't fear, it was strategy, the only way not to feed the fire burning in a man drunk on cheap authority. Her facial muscles tightened, but not a single word escaped her lips. Victor Delaunay sat in the front row, his newspaper folded long ago. He didn't need to read anymore. The real entertainment had started. He leaned slightly, raised a glass of wine, looked at Doyle with detached interest, then murmured to his assistant, voice cool but clear. "A cheap performance." Quiet as it was, the line earned a nod from his aide, gave Doyle the illusion of wealthy approval, and let Naomi see the truth, that she had become a character in a scene where everyone else in the room was just an indifferent audience. Doyle, now emboldened, struck the floor again with his cane, this time close to Naomi's feet. The sharp crack startled a few, but he laughed loudly. "Don't think that cloth makes you cleaner than where you came from. This place isn't for your kind. Lift your head. Let everyone see." The room murmured. A few scattered laughs flared, then died quickly when Victor glanced their way. Everyone seemed to understand. The one who truly held power wasn't Doyle or Grant, but the indifferent eyes and faint smile of the millionaire in the center. Each word he spoke landed like a slap, but Naomi didn't let her body flinch. The hardness in her eyes flashed just long enough for a few nearby to notice, but they quickly looked away. No one wanted to face the truth that they were witnessing a public humiliation. Victor lazily swirled his wine, his gaze drifting slowly from Naomi to Doyle. He neither stopped it nor encouraged it, but his cold detachment was itself a kind of permission for Doyle to continue. The contempt showed in how Victor leaned back, his hand relaxed, his faint smile unchanged, all suggesting that the scene unfolding was nothing more than an afternoon diversion. Naomi understood clearly that the room's silence was more dangerous than Doyle's cruel words. It revealed that no one here stood with her. But in that moment, she also understood that this very silence would reflect back the truth about them all. Every averted glance, every suppressed laugh was proof of complicity. And if she could remain standing, if she didn't fall beneath the weight of the insults, then that silence would become the burden they'd carry in shame later. Doyle leaned in closer, his breath filling the space between them, voice low but loud enough for all to hear. "You think you have the right to exist here? Without us, you're nothing. And remember, once the police speak, no one can protect you." He pulled back his cane, tapping it lightly against his palm, waiting for a reaction. Naomi lifted her eyes for a brief second, not with pleading, but with a cold glint that made Doyle hesitate. Then she dropped her gaze and returned to the cloth in her hand. The entire room settled into a half silence, half expectation. People waited to see if Naomi would fight back or fall apart. Doyle waited for a response to justify further humiliation. Victor waited for the script to continue according to his will, but Naomi remained standing, firm amid the venom, letting the tension grow heavier. And that very silence, in a moment that seemed powerless, only added to the discomfort of those who sought to break her. Because to those accustomed to abusing power, it's not enough to belittle. They need to see someone crumble before them. Naomi refused to give them that moment. In her quiet endurance, the chandelier-lit conference room became a proving ground, where every one of Doyle's words echoed like nails on a coffin. Yet the small woman stood tall, clutching the cloth like it was proof of a dignity no authority could take from her. The shrill ring of the landline phone cut sharply through the thick, tense air of the conference room. Its metallic sound bounced off the marble walls, making people flinch, as if the room itself had no more space for the silence Doyle had built with his insults. Naomi Brooks set the cloth down on the table, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the pressure searching for release. She walked toward a small table in the corner, where the phone continued to ring with a steady rhythm, like fate knocking at the door. Naomi picked up the receiver, her lips pressing together before opening, and her voice rang out, not in English, as everyone expected, but in a rich, firm, fluent stream of Dutch. Her opening phrase was crisp, and the tone so precise that even those who didn't understand the language could sense her confidence. She spoke steadily, then picked up speed as the caller on the other end gave more complex information. With every word, She transformed, not a quiet janitor being cornered, but a woman of intellect, wielding language with the certainty that only years of discipline could bring. For a moment, the entire room froze. The muffled laughter from earlier vanished, and the staff's eyes shifted away from Naomi, disbelief creeping in. But the silence didn't last. Officer Grant burst out laughing, short, choppy bursts filled with mockery. "What the hell is she babbling? Think anyone's buying that act?" He tilted his head toward Doyle, sharing his amusement, then looked at the hotel staff. "Look at that. Scrubbing floors 1 minute, pretending to be a scholar the next." His words dragged out a few uneasy chuckles, but no one dared laugh loudly, because within that steady Dutch rhythm, there was a strange, undeniable weight. Naomi didn't stop. Her voice flowed, pausing at the right moments, weaving in technical terms that made the call sound like a quiet symphony rising in a room that had been full of scorn. She didn't look at anyone, eyes fixed on a point in the air, her entire body standing as if in a different world, separated from every judging stare. Grant's taunts didn't break her rhythm. If anything, her voice grew steadier, as if the language itself was a shield keeping the storm at bay. In the corner, Victor Delaunay slowly lowered his wine glass, his hand suspended in midair. His eyes narrowed, startled, and he stopped breathing for a split second. He stared at Naomi, and this time his look was no longer casual. It was focused. His ears strained to catch each word, and though he only understood part of it, he recognized the sound of a native tongue he hadn't heard in a long time in a space of power like this. The faint smile he once wore vanished, replaced by a stillness that showed he didn't want to miss a single detail. This scene made Doyle frown slightly. He had never heard Naomi speak like that, and he certainly hadn't imagined that a woman he looked down on could use a foreign language with such confidence. He glanced at Grant, but this time Grant wasn't laughing. He bit his lip, eyes drifting away. The Dutch echoed through the luxurious room like an invisible strike, cracking the arrogance built on prejudice. Naomi placed her free hand on the table next to the phone, leaning in slightly to hear more clearly. She quickly translated a question, then answered with a full, firm response, each word sharp and precise. The person on the other end spoke in a steady, low voice, seemingly satisfied, and Naomi nodded a few times before offering a polite farewell. When she set the receiver down, the dry click of metal rang out with finality, like the closing bell on a theater of humiliation. The room was completely still. No more laughter, no more whispers. Naomi stood straight, hands together on the table, eyes looking ahead. In that moment, she was no longer a shadow in the conference hall, but the center of an unexpected shift. Victor was still watching, his gaze silent, but now holding something less easy to read. Grant, trying to regain control, blurted out, "She probably just memorized a few lines." But his voice wavered, no longer carrying the weight it once did. Doyle frowned again, but found no more words to mock her with. Even those who had smirked earlier were now looking at Naomi differently, some cautiously, some clearly unsettled. Naomi said nothing more. Her silence no longer meant endurance. It was a statement. She didn't need to explain anything because the truth had already revealed itself. With a single phone call, she had shifted the entire atmosphere, stripped the cruelty of its meaning, and made even someone like Victor take notice. In that silence, a strange feeling swept the room. For the first time, those used to dominance had no words to hold their place. Victor leaned forward, fingers interlaced, his eyes still fixed on Naomi. He had yet to speak, but the clarity of his attention was enough to show everyone that the balance was shifting. Doyle and Grant, once so sure of themselves, now stood awkwardly in the spotlight, surrounded by uncertain glances. Naomi remained still, composed, as if she had never been insulted, as if that phone call had been the strongest answer to everything that had just unfolded. Naomi Brooks had not yet set the receiver down when the voice on the other end offered a few final instructions. She responded with a long string of technical terms, speaking fluently and without hesitation, her voice firm, as if she were at an international conference rather than in a room full of people ready to demean her. Each word carried the strength of knowledge and discipline, making even those who didn't understand realize this was no act. A few hotel staff exchanged looks, surprise written across their faces. They had assumed Naomi only knew how to bow her head, wipe tables, and obey orders. But now she stood there, speaking a language most of them had never heard, turning the room's contempt into confusion. Officer Doyle, unwilling to accept the shift in momentum, frowned, his brows pulling so tight they nearly touched. He growled, trying to overpower Naomi's confidence. "Speak American. This isn't your damn slum." He punched each word, the phrase "damn slum" landing like a blow, trying to shove Naomi back into a place of inferiority. The words echoed off the marble walls, cold and sharp, prompting a few in the room to inhale quietly, though no one stepped in to stop him. Naomi remained calm, her eyes not turning toward Doyle, offering no response. Instead, she continued in the language he couldn't reach. Her silence in the face of his insult no longer meant endurance. It was a statement. She chose the language of intellect to respond to humiliation, wasting not a single breath on the poison he spoke. Doyle grew angrier, his lips moving as if to say more. But in that instant, another voice spoke from across the room. Victor Delaunay set his wine glass down, his body leaning slightly forward. All eyes followed the movement because in this room, every gesture from Victor carried weight. He spoke, but not in English. His voice came through in the same language Naomi had used, deep, steady, fluent Dutch. U spreekt Netherlands? The room fell instantly silent, no longer out of tension, but in shock. A wealthy, powerful millionaire had just spoken the same language as the woman they had dismissed as a cleaning lady. Naomi paused, her hand still resting on the table near the phone, her eyes fixed on Victor. The moment stretched long. She realized this was the first time since entering the room that someone had addressed her with respect, not a command or a threat. Her eyes flickered, then steadied. She answered simply, one word that shattered the wall of prejudice surrounding her. "Ja." That single word rang out clear. Not loud, but undeniable, echoing through the room as a declaration no one could refute. Doyle froze, his expression shifting as if he had been slapped in front of the crowd. Grant looked around in confusion, but no one backed him up, because Victor had just confirmed that the language was real, not a performance. The hotel staff who had sneered earlier now dropped their eyes, shame spreading in every glance that refused to meet hers. Victor said nothing more, but his eyes did not leave Naomi. In them was a mix of surprise and a hint of respect he could no longer hide. Naomi stood straight, neither stepping back nor forward, simply holding her ground. The word "ja" was not just an answer, it was a statement. She could, she had, and they were now witnesses to it. The grand conference room, once thought to belong only to those in tailored suits and smug smiles, had just become the place where a janitor flipped the balance with nothing but her voice. In that pause, everyone understood. The mockery had failed, and the power of language had just shifted the room's order. Doyle gripped his cane tightly, but it no longer gave him strength. Grant pressed his lips together, not daring to add a joke, and Victor, who until now had been the symbol of silent power, became the first to break through the wall of indifference. Naomi Brooks, with a single reply, had silenced the entire room and forced everyone to take a harder look at themselves. Victor Delaunay set his wine glass down on the table, the decisive movement loud enough to echo like a signal. He rose slowly, folding the newspaper that had rested loosely in his hand, now completely forgotten. The staff in the room immediately turned to him, because in this space of power, every gesture from Victor carried weight, and they knew something significant was about to shift. He scanned the room, his cold eyes pausing on each face before finally lowering his voice, firm and unmistakable. "Everyone out." The room went still, as if the air had been sucked out. No one had expected Victor to give such an order, especially one so clearly meant to shield a woman who, moments before, had been dismissed by everyone. The hotel staff dropped their gazes, unsure whether to leave or wait for further instruction. Doyle froze, hands still gripping his cane, but his eyes drifted, unwilling to move. Only Officer Grant reacted with instant fury, his words like a punch. "You're siding with a black maid over us?" His voice rang out harshly, the insult bare and deliberate, as if trying to drag Victor back to his side. All eyes turned to Victor. He didn't rush to respond. Instead, he walked slowly toward the center of the room, the sound of his shoes steady against the marble floor. He stopped directly in front of Grant, locking eyes with that still smoldering stare. His voice came low and cold, enough to chill the air around them. "I want to speak with her alone. This is not a request. It's an order." That final word dropped like a gavel, crushing any hope of resistance. Grant opened his mouth to argue, but Victor's glance silenced him before a word could come. Doyle looked from Grant to Naomi, searching for a reason to stay, but found none. The force in Victor's words came not just from his wealth, but from the absolute calm with which he made it clear that resistance was useless. The hotel staff began to move, their steps hurried, no one wanting to be the last left standing after Victor had spoken. Naomi stayed still, eyes following every movement. For the first time during this long afternoon of humiliation, the balance had truly shifted in her favor. As Grant was forced back, Doyle stepped aside, and every smirking face quietly exited. Naomi allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't bright, just a slight curve of her lips, but it carried enough strength to dissolve the shadow that had hung over her. In this room she was never meant to belong to, only her heartbeat remained, steady, along with Victor's full attention now fixed on her. The thick air gave way to an unfamiliar stillness. As the door closed behind the last person, Naomi and Victor stood face to face. He maintained his powerful stance, but his eyes had changed. No longer dismissive, now fully focused. He looked at Naomi as if weighing something, then spoke gently. "Where did you learn that language?" The question carried no command, only a quiet mix of curiosity and respect. Naomi lifted her head slightly, the smile still on her lips, and answered plainly, "I studied before my mother fell ill." Victor remained silent, his sharp gaze softening slightly. He realized the woman standing before him was not as simple as he had assumed. A janitor who could speak Dutch with such confidence was no accident, and that fact shattered the bias that had quietly lived in his mind. He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Do you know you silenced an entire room with a single sentence?" Naomi gave a slight nod and replied calmly, "Sometimes silence is stronger than talking back. But if given the chance, I'll always choose to let language speak for me." Her response caught Victor slightly off guard. He wasn't used to people speaking to him with such composure, especially not someone from a lower rung of society. A faint, unreadable smile flickered at the corner of his lips, but disappeared quickly. He turned, walked toward the large window, and looked down at the street, hands clasped behind his back. Naomi remained where she stood, steady. Between them now was no longer a dynamic of master and servant, but two people facing each other on the level of real worth. Outside the door, Grant and Doyle stood in the hallway, still refusing to leave completely. They pressed their ears to the wall, fuming at being shut out. "A maid getting a private meeting? This humiliates all of us," Grant muttered, his voice full of venom. Doyle clenched his jaw and replied, "Let him think what he wants, but we'll make sure she pays for this." What they didn't know was that this very moment, being cast out, would become evidence against them later, once the video spread. Inside, Naomi slowly released the tension in her hands, which had been clenched for so long. She hadn't expected to still be standing by this point, but somehow, she was. The slight smile lingered on her lips, not out of pride, but because for the first time, the balance had tipped in her favor. Even if only for a brief moment, it was enough for Naomi to understand that the power of truth, of knowledge, would always have its place, even in the most gilded of rooms. Victor turned back, his eyes locked on Naomi. He spoke each word clearly, with intention. "You are not what they said, and today, they were wrong." The words echoed like a seal of chain. Naomi met his gaze with quiet resolve, saying nothing more, because this time, the small smile at the corner of her mouth said everything for her. In a moment that seemed fragile, Naomi Brooks had crossed the line from being dismissed to being heard, and it was Victor Delaunay, the powerful millionaire, who became the first to acknowledge it through an act no one had dared to imagine, ordering an entire room into silence to make space for the voice of a janitor. Just as Naomi Brooks set the receiver down, and the air in the conference room still felt stretched tight like a wire pulled to its limit, in a far corner untouched by the chandelier's glow, a young hotel staffer had already pulled a phone from the pocket of his apron. His hands shook slightly as he hit record, knowing this could cost him his job if caught, but something in his gut told him this was a moment that couldn't be missed. In the narrow frame, Naomi stood tall, her voice rang out in Dutch, while Officer Grant and Doyle scowled, smirked uneasily, and the room fell into stillness when Victor Delaunay asked in Dutch, and Naomi answered with a simple, "Ja." The clip lasted only a few dozen seconds, but each one carried tension, humiliation, shock, and reversal. When the staffer left his shift, his hands still slightly trembling, he quickly sent the clip to a friend. That friend, after a quick glance, posted it to social media with a bold caption, "Hotel Maid shocks millionaire in Dutch." Within minutes, the first shares began. People clicked out of curiosity, expecting light entertainment from a luxury hotel, but as soon as Naomi's voice rose in that unfamiliar language, the comments erupted. Translated captions were quickly added, verified by a Dutch speaker confirming the precision in every word. In the comments, waves of outrage rolled in. One person wrote, "They mocked her for her skin and job. Now, who looks uneducated?" Another said, "This is why we need to film everything. No one would believe a woman could be humiliated like that in such a fancy room." Within an hour, the clip had been shared thousands of times and surged onto trending pages. Alongside the video, side stories about Naomi began to surface. Someone recognized her face, recalling seeing her at the university library years ago. Another person shared that she had once been a linguistics student, known for her quick grasp of languages before disappearing after a family crisis. That past only fueled the internet's anger further. An image of talent pushed into cleaning work, forced to endure public ridicule by police, made the injustice impossible to ignore. The video quickly broke past the walls of a single hotel. On Twitter, the hashtags number Respect Naomi and number Dutch Shock appeared, first with just a handful of users, then exploding into a trend. Short, powerful posts flooded timeline. One smug smile silenced by a single "ja." The cops laugh, but they're the ones exposed. Language has no class. People invent it. The viral storm turned what began as a shaky clip into a symbol of resistance. On international forums, especially in communities with Dutch speakers, the video sparked intense discussion. People were surprised to hear a black woman in a janitor's uniform speaking flawless Dutch with the tone of a native. One user wrote, "She sounds like she was trained in Utrecht, not a single beat off." That kind of confirmation crushed all doubt that Naomi had merely memorized a few phrases. It turned people like Grant and Doyle into jokes in the eyes of a global audience. While social media erupted, those who had been in the hotel conference room scrambled to explain themselves. Some staff members, speaking anonymously, messaged reporters, describing how Doyle struck the floor with his cane, how Grant mocked her skin color, and how Victor stayed coldly indifferent until the moment everything changed. But they all confirmed one detail. When Naomi answered in Dutch and Victor responded, the entire room went silent. That silence became a point of debate. People asked, why did no one in the room stand up to the police? Why did it take a millionaire to break the silence? Those questions only fueled public outrage. The video was no longer just about language. It had become proof of how society enables cruelty through quiet consent. Naomi had no idea the clip had gone viral. She continued her shift, cleaning long hallways and guest rooms after the day's events. But outside, millions were watching, outraged on her behalf, and seeing in her a reflection of themselves. A person dismissed but never defeated. Someone who held on to dignity and let truth speak for her. In less than a day, the video's share count broke records. On Instagram, still frames from the footage were turned into meme. On the left, Doyle slamming his cane captioned "False Power." On the right, Naomi holding the phone captioned "Truth Speaks." These images spread rapidly, becoming symbols of a new wave against discrimination. In a small cafe, two students talked. "Did you see that clip?" One word and everyone went silent. The other nodded, eyes lit up. "That's why we have to stand up. No one has the right to turn someone into a joke because of their job or their skin." That conversation echoed not just in one cafe, but in thousands of places, as people found in Naomi's story a lesson that resonated. The hashtags Respect Naomi and Dutch Shock continued climbing to the top of trending charts, appearing on the phone screens of millions. Journalists began contacting the hotel, demanding a response. The local police received a flood of calls questioning the conduct of Grant and Doyle. The men who once held power in the conference room were now dragged into the open, placed under the sharp glare of public judgment, while Naomi calmly polished glasses at the service counter, unaware that her composed actions had stirred an entire society. The world outside was now speaking her name with respect. The insults Grant and Doyle thought would crush her had instead become evidence against them, exposed to millions of eyes. And with a single phone call answered in Dutch, Naomi Brooks had become a new symbol of quiet strength, powerful enough to shift the balance. The video capturing Naomi Brooks answering the phone in Dutch didn't stop at sparking curiosity. Once shares passed the million mark, the online community entered a new phase. They didn't just watch, they joined in. On forums for black laborers, countless stories began to surface. A woman working at a hotel in Atlanta wrote, "My manager once yelled at me in front of guests, called me useless, even though I worked 10-hour shifts every day." Watching that video, I saw myself in Naomi, and I saw the injustice we live with every day. Below, hundreds of comments echoed her word. One told of mistreatment in a restaurant, another of being denied promotions solely because of skin color. Naomi's video had become a mirror, reflecting experiences long buried. An immigrant workers organization also joined, sharing the video with the caption, "We don't just clean, we don't just serve, we carry knowledge, language, and value that society often forgets." Within hours, personal stories became a movement. They added Naomi's image to digital posters, placing it beneath bold text, "No one is invisible." The image of a woman standing in a conference room, speaking fluent Dutch, became the symbol of a community long forced into silence. That wave of momentum gained strength when a respected voice entered the conversation. On an international news channel, Professor Johan Vermeer, a Dutch linguist, was invited to comment. He rewatched the video, nodding thoughtfully. "I can confirm her pronunciation is flawless. This is not someone reciting memorized lines. Her inflection, pacing, and vocabulary show formal training, and she's retained a very strong foundation." His validation crushed all claims that Naomi had been faking it. It turned the truth into a blade pointed at those who mocked her, because now the world knew they had ridiculed someone with genuine ability, someone likely beyond their own. As public outrage swelled, reporters turned to Victor Delaunay. During a press conference about a new investment project, he couldn't avoid the inevitable question. One journalist asked directly, "Mr. Delaunay, why did you take an interest in a cleaning woman? Why did you clear the room just to speak with her?" The question hung in the air, filled with surprise and a touch of doubt, as if they expected a tidy explanation to level out the narrative. Victor sat upright, eyes fixed on the camera lens, then answered slowly, "Because she deserves it." The brief reply needed no further elaboration, yet its impact spread across the room. A few journalists exchanged glances, recognizing that Victor had delivered a message more powerful than any prepared speech. In a society where titles and status usually define worth, a millionaire openly affirming the value of a woman dismissed for her job and race was nothing short of shocking. Immediately, that statement was clipped and shared alongside the original video. "Because she deserves it" became a new slogan, capitalized, bolded, and stamped across thousands of shared images. In online communities, heated discussions erupted. A group of black students debated, "We've stayed silent too long. They think just because we clean, serve, or carry trays, we have no worth." But Naomi proved that value doesn't come from a uniform. Another added, "Victor may be rich, but at least he bowed to the truth. If someone like him can change how he sees people, then no one has an excuse to justify prejudice anymore." At the same time, social activists seized the moment to push for change. A campaign called Respect the Invisible was launched, urging service workers to share their own experiences, using hashtags tied to Naomi's name. Within 2 days, thousands of stories poured in, from airport janitors to nannies in wealthy homes. They spoke of the quiet disrespect they'd swallowed for years, and they saw in Naomi a symbol of self-worth no one had the right to strip away. Naomi didn't know everything happening beyond the hotel walls. She still arrived for work, cleaning the same spaces as always. But the way people looked at her had changed. Co-workers no longer smirked, but paused with hesitation, sometimes even with respect. Regular guests, who once treated her as invisible, now gave her a nod when passing by. That shift wasn't born from sudden kindness, but from a recognition that she was no longer just a cleaner. She was Naomi Brooks, the woman who had captured the world's attention. In the days that followed, the media kept chasing the story. A major newspaper ran the headline, "When one word breaks down prejudice." The article argued that the moment Naomi answered in Dutch revealed two hard truths. First, the brutal bias of the police, and second, the power of knowledge to shift the balance of power. Commentators on TV said this wasn't just a viral moment, but a wake-up call for a system that had long dismissed those on its lowest rung. Victor Delaunay, after his brief statement, became a figure of public fascination. Some criticized him as a hypocrite, accusing him of protecting his image. Others believed the change in his eyes when he faced Naomi was genuine, that in that moment, something had touched the human side of a millionaire, known for his detachment. Whatever the argument, one thing was certain: he had become an unexpected ally in a battle he never planned to join. Naomi remained silent, keeping her distance from the press. She understood her voice had already been heard, and now the community would speak on her behalf. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The video, the Dutch professor's confirmation, and the words, "Because she deserves it," had triggered a wave that could no longer be stopped. And as that wave surged forward, it would sweep away not only the mockery of Grant and Doyle but also society's habit of staying silent in the face of injustice. In the quiet darkness of a break room after her shift, Naomi sat alone, her hand resting on the familiar cleaning cloth. She thought back to the moment Victor spoke in Dutch, remembered the stunned faces around her, and the small smile she allowed herself when the balance shifted. She understood that smile wasn't just for her, it was for everyone who had ever been dismissed, forced into silence. Now, they had an image to hold on to, a reason to rise, and a way to say out loud, human worth is never measured by job title or skin color. The storm of public outrage sparked by the Naomi Brooks video had not yet calmed when the police themselves poured fuel on the fire. Officer Grant, who had mocked Naomi in the center of the conference room, impulsively opened his personal social media account and posted a short but scornful line, "The internet's praising a floor scrubber now." The moment it went live, it spread at lightning speed. Instead of the support Grant expected, the post was met with a flood of fierce backlash. One commenter wrote, "You call her a floor scrubber, but she proved that knowledge rises above any uniform. You, a police officer, just exposed your own face." Another said harshly, "Yes, she cleans floors, but she does it with honest labor. You use power to humiliate others, so who's really low here?" Within hours, Grant's post became a lightning rod, drawing tens of thousands of angry comments. The strength of the public's reaction only made Grant more enraged. He began deleting harsh comments, but the more he erased, the more people flooded in. Screenshots spread everywhere, turning his original post into live evidence of his racism. Activists quickly seized on it as a textbook case of blind arrogance, using it to argue that the issue extended far beyond one hotel, that it lay in the systemic attitude within law enforcement. It didn't stop there. Officer Doyle also lost his composure. In a conversation with several reporters, he waved his hands in frustration. "She's making the police look bad. Don't think silence and a few foreign words can humiliate us. I'm going to countersue her for defamation and damaging the department's reputation." That threat was recorded and quickly circulated online. Rather than proving his point, he only deepened the fury. Comments poured in beneath the audio clip. "Your reputation isn't ruined by her, it's ruined by what you did." Another wrote, "This shows he's not sorry. He just wants to shift blame to the victim." Amid the outrage, the media pounced. Major headlines appeared across front pages. "Police threaten Maid after Dutch twist." Some TV channels were even more direct, flashing banners across the screen, from a Dutch phone call to police intimidation. These headlines escalated tensions, not just by reporting fact, but by spotlighting a stark power imbalance. On one side, a working woman. On the other, those with authority to enforce the law. On international forums, legal experts commented that the actions of Grant and Doyle may have violated civil rights, as they had used their position as police officers to intimidate and demean an innocent individual. Human rights organizations quickly stepped in, calling for a formal investigation. If they're willing to do this publicly in a luxury hotel, imagine what they'd do with no cameras around, one report stated. That argument struck a nerve with the public, intensifying the demand for justice. During those days, Naomi continued working. She heard bits and pieces that things were spreading, but she didn't grasp the full scale. As she walked through the halls, the looks directed at her had changed, no longer filled with disdain, not merely curious, but respectful. A young employee whispered softly to her, "You made all of us hold our heads higher." Naomi responded with a small smile, but inside, she knew this had gone far beyond a personal moment. It had become a public confrontation between truth and abused power. In that context, Grant's posts and Doyle's threats acted like fuel to a fire already burning. Political commentary shows began inviting experts to analyze the situation, asking, why do those entrusted to protect treat citizens with such contempt? Live discussions were held, callers voicing their anger. One elderly woman, her voice trembling on the radio, said, "I've been a domestic worker for 30 years. No one ever stood up for me when I was humiliated. Now I feel hope, thanks to Naomi." Her words transformed the incident from a viral clip into a true movement. As the media storm intensified, the local police leadership found themselves cornered. They could no longer ignore it. The evidence was too clear, the public too loud. A spokesperson reluctantly issued a statement. "We will review the conduct of the officers involved." But the statement only deepened the outrage. It was vague, lacking urgency. People kept sharing the video, the screenshots, the posts, driving home one message: Naomi Brooks was no longer alone, and any attempt to cover up the truth would be exposed. In that conference room, the insults once thought to pass unnoticed had now become evidence viewed by the world. And when Grant and Doyle chose extreme reactions, they made themselves enemies of the public. Naomi didn't need to say another word. Those who once mocked her had already revealed their true selves. The annual Economic Forum, held at the downtown convention center, gathered hundreds of business leaders, politicians, and members of the press. On the grand stage, Victor Delaunay stepped out in a tailored suit, his expression as serious as ever. People expected him to speak about numbers, new investment plan, and the kind of sweeping strategies everyone wanted to hear to predict the market's direction. But today, the room carried a different tone, because everyone knew the public was still reeling from the viral video, and Victor was at its center. He took the microphone, eyes sweeping across the hushed audience. Instead of starting with economic data, Victor paused for a few seconds, then said slowly, "Some things matter more than numbers. Talent is not limited by a uniform." The statement rang out, firm and clear, sending a shock through the hall. In the crowd, journalists raised their pens. Some executives frowned, while others nodded with quiet thought. That brief sentence was enough for everyone to understand exactly whom Victor was speaking about. He didn't sidestep, didn't obscure, pure, he directly affirmed Naomi Brooks's worth in front of hundreds of influential figures. A room used to dry speeches suddenly came alive. Applause broke out, starting with a few scattered claps, then rising into a wave of agreement. Hundreds of people, all holding power and position, stood together, not just to applaud Victor, but to recognize a truth that had just been declared. Amid the applause, phones came out to capture the moment, and within minutes, Victor's words were spreading rapidly online. The quote was paired with footage of Naomi speaking Dutch, forming a unified message. It became a kind of emotional armor for millions following the story, a reminder that truth and talent cannot be erased by prejudice. Victor didn't say much more. He paused only long enough for the applause to fade, then continued with the scheduled economic speech. But the public understood he had chosen the most pivotal moment to send a clear message. He wasn't just speaking to the room, he was speaking to a society watching his every move. His words landed like an arrow in the hearts of those who had once mocked Naomi, and at the same time opened a door for them to reflect on their own actions. The forum soon returned to its regular pace, but the impact of Victor's statement lingered. On social media, new hashtags emerged, now tied to his quote. One person wrote, "Talent is not limited by a uniform. Remember that the next time you judge someone." Another posted, "If even a cold millionaire admits it, the truth must be undeniable." Victor's declaration had unintentionally added momentum to a rising movement, turning it into a wave too powerful to stop. In the backstage shadows, Victor stood still for a few seconds after stepping off the stage. He didn't appear smug, only closed his eyes, letting the echo of applause linger in his ears. He knew that from this moment on, everything had changed. He was no longer a bystander observing what happened at the hotel, but someone who had publicly taken a stand beside Naomi. And once a position is chosen, there's no going back. But Victor had no regrets, because he understood that sometimes a timely sentence carried more power than the most complex business strategy. In the break room of the police station, a wall-mounted television was broadcasting the economic forum live. When Victor Delaunay spoke the words, "Talent is not limited by a uniform," the roaring applause from the auditorium came through the screen, turning the air in the room dense and heavy. Officer Grant sat frozen, his face once flushed with anger now pale, eyes darting as if searching for a way out. Doyle crossed his arm, trying to look composed, but his fingers tapped rapidly on his sleeve, betraying his unease. They both understood that when a millionaire, heard by the entire world, publicly sided with Naomi Brooks, the story had slipped beyond their control. This was no longer a noisy viral clip. It had become a truth confirmed before the public, and it made them feel as if they had been stripped bare. On social media, Naomi's name surged. Clips splicing her speaking Dutch with Victor's speech spread everywhere. No one referred to her as just a hotel maid anymore. They used her full name, Naomi Brooks. Every post was a declaration, a wave of applause echoing that moment. Naomi made an entire auditorium rise without even being there, one user wrote. When a woman standing in the shadows is lit by truth, we finally see what has long been hidden. Naomi, meanwhile, continued working her evening shift as usual. She didn't know how much attention was circling her outside. But within the hotel, signs of change began to appear. When she entered the dining room to clean, a few co-workers paused and looked over, not with scorn, but with hesitation and respect. An older guest, who once passed her as if she were invisible, gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. Naomi returned it with a soft smile, but she felt the difference deeply. The silence that once swallowed her in the conference room had now turned into a kind of attention that could no longer be ignored. The next morning's newspapers ran bold headlines. From unknown maid to symbol of justice, Naomi Brooks. Television aired discussion panel, inviting sociologists to explore the meaning behind the event. One commentator said, "The important part isn't just that she spoke Dutch, but that she maintained her dignity in the face of humiliation. That's the message the public connects with." From an unexpected moment, Naomi had become the center of a sweeping social conversation. While Grant and Doyle sat uneasily in front of the screen, pushed into a defensive corner, Naomi, the woman they once humiliated, was being praised everywhere. Every article, every comment, every viral hashtag added another layer of light shining on her. The public wasn't just interested in the hotel incident, but began asking broader questions. How many other Naomis are out there? How many people of talent and dignity have been crushed by prejudice? Naomi suddenly became a symbol for them, even though she had never intended to. From the moment Victor publicly took a stand, the balance of power shifted dramatically. Naomi was no longer seen as an invisible worker, but as a symbol of truth and self-respect. And as her name echoed through millions of conversations, those who once looked down on her now had to bow before the force of public opinion. Naomi Brooks, from the lowest position, had become the center of a storm no one saw coming. The public's attention toward Naomi Brooks didn't stop at reporting the video or Victor Delaunay's statement. Journalists began digging into her past, trying to uncover who this woman really was. Persistent reporters found university records showing Naomi had once been a standout linguistics student, known for her exceptional aptitude for languages. Her transcripts revealed top performance during her first 2 years, particularly in European languages, but she abruptly dropped out when her mother fell seriously ill. The city's largest newspaper ran the headline, "Woman Dismissed at Hotel, was once a rising star in linguistics." The revelation added another piece to the puzzle, deepening the public's outrage over how life had forced Naomi to abandon her dream to survive. Soon after, a television station tracked down a former classmate. In the interview, the friend smiled fondly, saying, "Naomi picked up languages with unbelievable speed. I remember she once translated a piece of Dutch literature into French overnight. She spoke 4 languages, and if it hadn't been for her family situation, she'd definitely be a professor by now." The clip spread quickly, not only confirming Naomi's academic strength, but also highlighting the injustice of someone so gifted having to work as a cleaner to support her family. Viewers were moved to learn that behind her calm smile and steady gaze was a life of sacrifice. They realized Naomi hadn't just picked up Dutch by chance, but once had a bright future, which she gave up to carry the weight of responsibility. Thousands of comments flooded in under the interview video, many expressing admiration and sorrow. A woman of talent and strength. We've been far too quick to underestimate people like her. The more I learn about Naomi, the angrier I get about how the police treated her. The pieces of Naomi's story gradually came together, transforming her from a face in a viral video into a person of depth. People began comparing her sacrifice to that of others who rose from hardship. International outlets published articles titled, "Naomi Brooks, From Lecture Hall to Mop, and Now to the Public's Heart." These pieces didn't romanticize her life, but argued that the burdens that forced Naomi to pause her academic path also shaped her resilience, allowing her to remain composed when humiliated, something few could do. The community kept sharing her story, not to pry, but to affirm her worth. They emphasized that true ability doesn't disappear just because someone takes a different job. Naomi was proof. Even after leaving school, she preserved her knowledge and strength, and in one moment, it all became clear to the world. This fueled the social movement even more, demanding respect for service workers, because no one knows what stories or talents lie behind the uniforms they wear. Naomi still did not appear before the media, but her image was everywhere. Phrases like, "She speaks 4 languages," were shared alongside a picture of her smiling in the clip, becoming a widely spread message. The more people learned about the secret that had been revealed, the more they believed Naomi was not just the symbol of a moment, but living proof of how deeply someone can be misjudged when society looks only at the uniform they wear. The public's reaction after the revelation about Naomi Brooks quickly turned into widespread outrage directed at the police. On social media platforms, comments demanding accountability flooded in. "You ruined someone's future with just a few insults." That statement was shared tens of thousands of times, becoming a digital banner across forums. The incident was no longer seen as a minor confrontation in a hotel, but as living evidence of how destructive prejudice and abused power can be. One social organization published an analysis pointing out that even a single mocking comment or dismissive attitude can force a talented person into enduring injustice, and when repeated systemically, it destroys thousands of lives. That outrage was further fueled by stark contrasts. On one side was Naomi, a former top linguistics student who spoke 4 languages, forced by circumstance into labor work to care for her ill mother. On the other side were police officers with power, using it to humiliate, pressure, and even threaten. This contrast intensified the public's anger, with many viewing the police not just as having made a mistake, but as having directly contributed to burying part of Naomi's future. Calls for independent investigations grew louder, and major news outlets dedicated special reports to this wave of indignation. Meanwhile, Naomi continued her shifts at the hotel. She made no public comments, gave no interviews, and didn't use the sudden fame for personal gain. She walked the halls with her mop in hand, her gaze calm, her steps steady. Her silence wasn't avoidance, but a quiet statement. Her life had always been built on work and responsibility, not media attention. The hotel was now busier than usual due to the viral story, but Naomi's pace remained unchanged, her cleaning precise and consistent as always. Some coworkers looked at her differently. They were more careful, less mocking, and at times, even showed a hint of respect. But Naomi didn't seek pity or admiration, maintaining her composure as if none of it concerned her. She understood that outside, the storm of public opinion would keep pressing the police, while her role was to stay grounded, not swept up by fleeting emotions. That calmness earned her even more respect from observers, because in the eye of the storm, she chose silence and stayed true to the work that had always defined her. From another perspective, that calmness was the strongest statement of all. While those who once insulted her scrambled to justify, threaten, and deflect responsibility, Naomi simply continued her shift, her steady gaze and faint smile enough to prove the power of truth. She didn't need to shout because the community had done that for her, and it was that very silence that highlighted a striking paradox. The woman once dismissed now stood at the center, forcing society to reflect on how it treats those at the very bottom. The pressure from public opinion didn't stop at online debates. It reached all the way to official agencies. Amid growing outrage, the police department's internal affairs division was forced to formally intervene. A brief but clear statement announced that they would conduct a full review of Officer Grant and Officer Doyle's actions during the hotel incident. Instantly, this update became the new focal point, with the media dissecting every detail, affirming that this was no longer a personal dispute between a hotel maid and two officers, but a major test of transparency and accountability for an entire system. Journalists quickly dug deeper, and then the pieces began to fall into place. A series of leaked internal emails surfaced, revealing conversations between Grant, Doyle, and several colleagues. The messages were filled with derogatory remarks about people of color and jokes, implying that service workers belonged to a lower class that needed to be controlled. One reporter published an excerpt. "Just look at those cleaning staff, and you'll see why we need to keep authority. Otherwise, they'll think they're equal." That email was widely shared, becoming undeniable proof of the deep-rooted bias in these officers' mindset. Public backlash intensified as people realized that what happened at the hotel wasn't a moment of poor judgment, but the result of long-held beliefs. Sociologists appeared on television to explain that this was the core of the issue. When people with prejudice are granted enforcement power, abuse becomes almost inevitable. One analyst commented, "That email reads exactly like the way they treated Naomi. They didn't just insult her, they used humiliation as a tool to maintain a power gap." On online forums, others who had experienced mistreatment by police began sharing their own story, linking them to the leaked evidence. One post read, "When I reported a theft, the officer laughed and told me to get back to work because nothing I lost mattered. They treat us like we're worthless." These personal accounts gave the emails even more weight, transforming the incident from an isolated case into a clear example of systemic discrimination. Internal affairs now faced pressure from two sides, the public demanding transparency and the institution fearing reputational damage. But with such clear evidence, delay was not an option. An investigation was launched, and both Grant and Doyle were placed on temporary suspension. Still, the suspensions did little to satisfy public demand, as people called for true accountability, not just a gesture to quiet the storm. Headlines began asking, "Is this the start of reform, or just a tactic to calm the crowd?" Naomi heard about the investigation while cleaning a row of empty rooms in the hotel. She stood still for a few minutes, sensing the shift sparked by her experience. But instead of feeling triumphant, her gaze remained calm. Naomi knew that a few administrative decisions couldn't erase years of prejudice. But at the very least, the leaked emails had proven one thing. The insults hurled that day weren't imagined, but merely the tip of a much larger iceberg. And this time, the spotlight of public scrutiny had managed to shine beneath the surface. In her quiet, Naomi understood she wasn't fighting alone anymore. Now, the whole society was stepping into that battle with her. And as doors that had long remained closed were finally open, the truth had begun to find its way through. Before the disciplinary committee's announcement had time to settle, Naomi Brooks received an official summons. She was requested to appear as a witness in the internal investigation, a development that only heightened public interest. The woman who had once quietly held a mop was now considered central to the case, her testimony capable of determining the fate of the two suspended officers. Naomi read the letter in the small back room after her shift, feeling no satisfaction, only a heavy weight. She knew that appearing before the panel wasn't just about recounting what had happened, but about facing a system that had forced countless others like her into silent submission. The day Naomi entered the investigation room, the atmosphere was unlike anything she had ever experienced at the hotel. No cane striking the floor, no mocking laughter, just the focused stares of supervisors, attorneys, and reporters waiting just outside. Naomi sat down, hands clasped in front of her, eyes steady. The hearing's lead officer began by asking her to recount the entire incident. Naomi didn't rush. She spoke detail by detail, from the moment Grant entered with his insults, to Doyle deliberately blocking her path, to the ring of the phone. Her voice was steady, not angry, not evasive, but laying out each piece of truth as if setting them gently on the table. But what the panel couldn't ignore was the video recorded in that very hotel room. When the first witness finished, the screen lit up. Naomi appeared clearly, holding the receiver, her fluent Dutch echoing in the room, while behind her, Grant sneered, and Doyle frowned in irritation. Then came the moment Victor Delaunay stood and asked a direct question in Dutch, prompting Naomi's single-word reply that silenced the room. Those images couldn't be twisted, couldn't be denied. They captured, with brutal clarity, the oppressive atmosphere Naomi had endured. When the clip ended, the investigation room fell silent. Naomi didn't need to say anything more. The footage had spoken for her. Some panel members exchanged looks, others scribbled quick notes, and in that very moment, public reaction outside swelled even more. News outlets posted real-time updates. Hotel video becomes key evidence against officers Grant and Doyle. Those following from afar felt a surge of satisfaction, knowing that the truth no longer relied solely on Naomi's testimony. It had now been irrefutably captured on film. Naomi left the room with a calm expression. She knew the battle was far from over, that the two officers would find every possible way to defend themselves, that the system might still shield them. But at the very least, from this moment on, she no longer stood alone. What happened in that luxurious hotel room that day, once just an afternoon filled with humiliation, had now become evidence placed on the scales of justice. And with that evidence exposed, no one could deny the truth that a woman once looked down upon was now forcing an entire system to bow its head. The hearing room was brightly lit, the long rows of seats filled with stern faces. At the witness stand, Officer Grant sat upright, his hands clenched tightly on his knees to stay composed. Across from him sat the disciplinary board, where a seasoned lawyer had just risen, eyes sharp and fixed on him. His voice rang out, clear and heavy. "What did you call her?" The entire room went silent, as if everyone was holding their breath for the answer. Grant swallowed hard, then replied stiffly, "It was just a joke." He spoke quickly, as if trying to cut off all consequences, but the strained tone betrayed the fear beneath. That flimsy excuse stirred murmurs across the board. A few shook their heads, and hers scribbled notes into their files. The lawyer didn't back down, leaning forward and pressing harder. "You think a joke is enough to humiliate a person, to silence an entire room, to turn her into a target of mockery? Is this how an officer understands his duty?" Grant bit his lip, eyes darting around, searching for support from his peers, but finding only Doyle sitting silently behind him, avoiding eye contact. The video was replayed right after, showing Naomi Brooks answering the phone in fluent Dutch, her voice clear and firm, sending a jolt through the room. When the screen went dark, no one could claim it had all been a misunderstanding. The lawyer tapped his pen on the table, voice lowering. "Do you still call this a joke when the evidence shows clear contempt?" Grant opened his mouth, but only muttered a few meaningless words before falling silent. Naomi sat in the witness row, her eyes fixed on Grant. She didn't need to speak. The truth was already evident, but the calm in her presence added weight to the entire hearing. A board member looked directly at Grant and said, "Her silence that day was not agreement. It was proof she was under the pressure of power. And that very power, instead of protecting, was used by you to trample." Those words drained the color from Grant's face, his throat tightening. Outside the hearing room, reporters crowded in, headlines updating non-stop. Grant blames it on a joke. Lawyer presses hard on derogatory conduct. The public watching via live stream erupt, many commenting that Grant's defense was a second insult, treating someone's pain as harmless fun. The outrage surged, increasing pressure on the disciplinary board. The hearing dragged on with harsh questions, and each clumsy answer pushed Grant further into a corner. Doyle was called up next, and though he tried to stay composed, his testimony couldn't deny the leaked emails. Every effort to defend themselves crumbled as the evidence piled up and the truth stared back through every tense glance in the room. As the hearing ended, Naomi rose from the witness seat. Her steps were light but steady, her face calm and composed. Across from her, Grant sat with his head down, shoulders slumped, the arrogance he once displayed in the hotel completely gone. Without a single word of protest, it was truth and the power of justice that forced him to retreat. And for Naomi, today's hearing marked a turning point, transforming a moment of humiliation into the beginning of exposing a system once thought untouchable. Naomi Brooks rose from the witness row, her frame not imposing but exuding a quiet strength that brought the room to silence. She looked directly at the panel, then stopped at Officer Grant, who kept his head down, avoiding her gaze. Her voice rang out, calm, slow, each word clear. "A joke never undoes the blood of generations oppressed. The words weren't loud, but their weight hit like a wave, making every wall in the room feel closer. In that moment, Naomi was no longer a hotel worker, but a voice for all those who had lived under mockery and scorn. The atmosphere in the hearing room thickened. A few board members nodded, others stayed silent, but their eyes revealed agreement. Grant flinched slightly, while Doyle shifted in his seat, as if trying to shrink. Naomi said nothing more, knowing that one sentence was enough. The silence that followed stretched for several seconds, but the impact echoed far beyond, reaching past the four walls of the hearing. Immediately after the questioning ended, the press rushed to report. Television stations edited footage of Naomi speaking, pairing it with the clip of her answering in Dutch to craft a single, powerful message. From silence under humiliation to a firm declaration before a disciplinary board. Major headlines read, Naomi Brooks, from punchline to reckoning. One sentence shakes the hearing room, and justice is not a joke. Readers shared and debated, sending Naomi's name once again across every corner of social media. Online, the public began quoting her words as a slogan. Posts spread rapidly. A joke never undoes the blood of generations oppressed, alongside photos of Naomi standing with calm but unyielding eyes. The quote transcended the specific case, becoming a reminder that mockery does more than hurt in the moment. It stretches across generations, building into a collective memory. Reporters turned to human rights groups, and all of them echoed Naomi's words to anchor their message. One activist said, "We often hear the phrase, just a joke," but Naomi showed that behind those jokes lies a long history of wounds. She turned personal pain into fuel for a community. These remarks aired during primetime, turning what seemed like a dry hearing into a national moment of reckoning. While the media and online communities roared, Naomi returned to the hotel as usual. She walked quietly down the hallway, her gaze calm, but deep inside, she knew she had crossed the boundary of an individual story. Her words had been recorded, repeated, and would outlive that afternoon in the hearing room. They didn't just make two officers lower their heads, but forced an entire society to confront the truth that words, seemingly harmless, can carry destructive power, and only by daring to speak can one reclaim their dignity. As Naomi Brooks's words continued to resonate, the council proceeded to call additional witnesses. A middle-aged man stepped in, his posture firm but his voice hoarse with emotion. He testified that 2 years earlier, Officer Grant had pulled him over without cause, then hurled racial slurs at him in front of his young son, who sat silently beside him. The next witness, a woman, recounted how Doyle had stormed into her home during an administrative check and called her degrading name. The testimonies followed one another, each witness a piece of a puzzle, and when assembled, the full picture came into view. The humiliation Naomi endured wasn't an exception, but part of a long-standing pattern of abuse. The council sat in silence, no longer able to mask their reaction, as every story echoed the same behavior captured in the now viral clip. With each person who spoke, the truth became harder to deny. Reporters outside provided constant updates, every new detail fueling public outrage. People realized Naomi wasn't a lone target made into a joke. There were many others who had quietly endured the same treatment. Some witnesses, previously too afraid to speak, now found courage in Naomi's story. They asserted that the officers had abused their power to instill fear, turning humiliation into a daily routine. The collective act of speaking out transformed the atmosphere of the hearing room, turning it into a true forum for justice. Meanwhile, human rights organizations officially entered the conversation. A statement from the National Human Rights League declared they would monitor the investigation closely and would not allow the case to be buried. They pointed to the leaked email, combined with the witness accounts, as clear evidence of systemic discrimination. An international labor rights group announced it would send representatives to the city to oversee the proceedings, emphasizing that this case exemplified how service workers are routinely devalued and left vulnerable to abuse. Public response quickly reinforced these declarations. Thousands of people shared the statement, treating them as proof that Naomi and the other witnesses would not be abandoned. Small protests began forming outside police headquarters, where participants held signs quoting witness testimonies, such as, "Not a joke anymore," and "We are not invisible." News outlets captured these images, and international media soon picked up the story, spreading the event far beyond the borders of the United States. Naomi read everything through short news updates on her old phone screen. She quietly scrolled, eyes calm but bright, understanding that her voice had sparked something far greater. Now that human rights organizations had stepped in, the fight was no longer hers alone. It had become a declaration that all abuses of power would be exposed, and anyone who had endured humiliation had the right to rise and reclaim their dignity. In the stillness of a late evening after work, Naomi knew the road ahead was still long, but this time, she had a whole community walking with her. After the witness testimonies were released one by one, social media quickly gave the event a name to remember. Overnight, the phrase Dutch Maid scandal appeared everywhere, becoming a label for the rising movement. Images of Naomi Brooks were paired with the words, turning them into a viral slogan, not just to recall the moment she spoke Dutch, but to expose the truth that the humiliation she suffered had become the spark to reveal an entire system. On Twitter, the phrase rapidly climbed to the top of the trending list, bringing with it long opinion threads, commentary videos, and street interviews. Everyone had something to say, and most agreed that what had happened could not be dismissed with a few formal apologies. International media also began using Dutch Maid scandal as a key term in their coverage. A European news channel emphasized, "This incident is not just about a hotel in America. It shows how power can be misused to degrade the vulnerable." That commentary was widely shared, drawing even more attention. People were no longer just discussing Grant or Doyle, but raising broader questions about the cultural foundations that allowed such behavior to persist. What began as a conversation in a hotel meeting room had now become a global symbol of racial discrimination and abuse of power. Local officials were caught off guard. At first, they tried to remain cautious, merely stating that the situation was under review. But when the Dutch Maid scandal was everywhere, they had no choice but to officially announce a full investigation. The city's mayor held a press conference declaring, "We are committed to addressing every violation. Authorities will examine everything from the leaked emails to every detail in the viral video." The announcement spread immediately, hit front pages, and was seen by the public as the first sign that social pressure had forced the system to act. Public response following the announcement only strengthened the wave of outrage. Some activists called for continued monitoring of the investigation to prevent a paper-only process. Online forums were held, drawing thousands of participants, who repeated Naomi's story as a reminder that justice only matters when fully carried out. In other cities, handwritten signs saying, "Justice for Naomi," appeared at small rallies, proving that the event had grown far beyond its original setting. Naomi heard about the term Dutch Maid scandal when a colleague handed her the morning paper. She looked at the bold headline, did not smile, and simply folded it back in silence. To her, what had unfolded was now beyond her control, and the fact that society had given the story a name meant it had become part of collective history. Her eyes grew somber, but she knew deep down that the next steps would determine not only the fate of Grant and Doyle, but also the chance to shift how society views workers on the lowest rung. From a spontaneous moment answering the phone in Dutch, Naomi had become the center of a movement with global reach. And when the authorities announced a full investigation, the public understood that the path to justice had truly begun, though it remained full of obstacles. Dutch Maid scandal was no longer just a term online, but a declaration that the truth would be uncovered, and that a woman once looked down upon had forced an entire system to bow before justice. As the media storm known as the Dutch Maid scandal continued to sweep across the country, all eyes turned to the results of the official investigation. The hearings had concluded, evidence had been gathered, witnesses had spoken, and the disciplinary board was forced to make a decision. The announcement came on a cloudy morning, but the social atmosphere exploded. Officer Grant and Officer Doyle were suspended from duty and faced severe disciplinary action. The decision stated clearly that their actions were not only violations of the code of conduct, but also damaged the reputation of the entire police force. Those words were quoted repeatedly in the press, a public declaration that humiliation could not be dismissed as just a joke. As the news broke, reactions split across the spectrum. In many cities, people applauded the outcome, calling it a victory for truth and justice. Human rights organizations issued a joint statement, emphasizing that this was an important milestone, while reminding the public that disciplining two officers was only the beginning. An entire system still needed reform. On public forums, many noted that Naomi Brooks had become the face that forced an institution to yield, even though she had never claimed to lead a movement. Her calm, measured approach without outrage only made the public believe more strongly in the weight of her testimony. While Grant and Doyle faced the collapse of their careers, the hotel where it all happened could not escape scrutiny. Under pressure from the public, the media, and business partners, the hotel's management was forced to hold a public press conference. The hotel manager appeared before a sea of cameras, face tense. He read from a prepared statement, admitting the environment of discrimination had been allowed to exist in a space advertised as luxurious and safe. "We apologize for not acting in time, and for allowing an employee to be humiliated in front of others," he said, his voice lowered. That apology echoed under the cold watch of public opinion. Many viewed it as too late, but at least it was an acknowledgement of responsibility. News broadcasts replayed the manager's bow, juxtaposed with footage of Naomi in her simple uniform, prompting comparisons. On one side, a belated apology. On the other hand, a woman standing tall in the middle of the storm. Commentators wrote, "The hotel didn't apologize out of principle. The public forced them to." These criticisms only underscored a hard truth. Power structures yield only under pressure, and that is why society must remain vigilant. Naomi heard about the apology while sitting in the employee break room. A co-worker handed her a phone to show the live broadcast. Naomi watched the hotel manager bow in silence, then quietly closed the screen. Her eyes showed no satisfaction, only a steady calm. To her, this apology could not change the past or erase the humiliation she had endured, but it was a signal that justice, however delayed, could still be heard. She understood the real value of the moment lay in the fact that those once dismissed now had reason to believe their voices were not meaningless. In the following days, the media continued to analyze the verdict. Editorials stated that the suspension of Grant and Doyle sent a message that abuse of power would no longer be tolerated, but also questioned whether the institutions involved had the resolve to go beyond holding just two individuals accountable. Many commentators pointed back to leaked emails, showing that other officers shared similar prejudiced attitudes. The public called for the investigation to widen, so the Dutch Maid scandal would not be reduced to a single incident. Small protests continued outside police headquarters, with participants holding signs demanding justice, not just for Naomi, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed because of their skin color or job. Meanwhile, the service worker community felt empowered. They looked to Naomi as a symbol that maintaining dignity could force society to confront itself. Personal stories continued to surface, tied to the verdict, as if this was finally the moment they were being heard after years of silence. Words that once made them lower their head were now driving them to stand tall. The verdict against Grant and Doyle was not just punishment, it was proof of what a unified community could achieve. And when the hotel was forced to apologize, the broader picture became clearer. No one was exempt from accountability, from the individuals who inflicted harm to the institution that allowed it. Naomi Brooks, through her calm and steady resolve, had tipped the scales of justice toward truth. From this point forward, the story was no longer just about two officers. It marked the beginning of a longer journey, forcing society to re-examine how it treats those most often overlooked. As the suspension notice for Grant and Doyle and the hotel's belated apology began to circulate, public pressure showed no signs of fading. Each small protest, each rising hashtag on social media, pushed the city council to call an emergency meeting. The large chamber typically used for budget discussions became a public battleground, where every glance carried tension, and each word spoken landed like an arrow. Council members filed in one by one, some whispering to each other, some avoiding eye contact, knowing that any hesitation could result in public condemnation. Files lay neatly stacked on the long wooden table, while outside the doors, dozens of journalists packed tightly together, cameras aimed and ready, waiting for any signal from inside. From the very start, the tone of the meeting was different. Instead of opening with routine procedures, the council chair struck the gavel firmly and addressed the issue directly. "We cannot treat this as an isolated incident. This is a wake-up call for the entire system." The words silenced the room, and every person looked to one another, knowing that without concrete action, public trust would collapse. One council member stood and spoke sharply. "If two officers can abuse their power inside a luxury hotel, in front of countless witnesses, what has already happened in places with no cameras, no one watching?" The question dropped like a stone, forcing everyone to sit in uneasy silence, thinking about the weight of what was at stake. Over the next few hours, suggestions poured in. Some proposed creating an independent oversight committee to launch a broader investigation, not just into Grant and Doyle, but into the entire unit they belonged to. Others emphasized the need to restructure police training programs to root out bias from the recruitment stage. One member raised concerns that pushing too far could damage the relationship between local government and law enforcement. The debate grew heated, voices rising and falling, pens tapping loudly against desks. Outside, a crowd gathered around a large screen in the square, cheering loudly for bold declarations and booing when hesitation crept in. Amid the arguments, one figure sat quietly at the back of the room, her deep black eyes unmoving. Aisha, a representative from a local human rights organization, had been invited to attend as an observer. She did not interrupt, did not tap her pen or clear her throat, only sat still, silent like a hidden blade. Her gaze swept over every speaker, dissecting each word, each nod, each forced smile. Aisha's silence was not passive, it was pressure. Her presence kept the room from drifting into platitudes. Everyone there understood that outside these walls, the public was watching, and inside, her eyes represented thousands who had once been ignored. When one council member suggested closing the session with a promise to look into it further, Aisha tilted her head, her eyes flashing cold. No words were needed. Her look alone made it clear that vague promises would not escape the wrath of public reaction. Immediately, the chair responded, "We need a clearer statement. The public is demanding answers." The energy in the room shifted. More specific proposals followed, including establishing a hotline to report misconduct, expanding civilian oversight powers, and inviting independent experts to assess police practices. Reporters outside picked up fragments from insiders and immediately went live. City council in heated debate, pressure mounting. No final decision yet. The crowd responded with loud chants demanding action. They would not accept vague promises. It was that shouting, combined with Aisha's blade-like gaze from the back of the room, that forced the council to take another step forward. As the clock neared midnight, the council chair stood and announced, "We will expand the investigation. It will not stop with 2 individuals, but extend to the entire unit, and the full findings will be made public." Applause erupted outside the building, and news outlets flashed the headline, "City Council approves full investigation." The room was still weary after hours of debate, but the decision marked a turning point. The members looked at one another, acknowledging they had been cornered into action, but also realizing that without follow-through, the seats they held would lose all meaning. And in the dark corner of the room, Aisha remained seated, silent. Yet her presence hung in the air like a sharp blade, making it clear that every promise made would have to be backed by action. When the session ended, the council members left one by one, faces tight with tension. Aisha stood last, walking slowly. Her shadow stretched long across the cold tile floor. A reporter tried to approach her with a question, but she gave only a faint smile and no reply. She knew her silence carried more weight than any public statement, and from this point on, every step the council took would be scrutinized by society at large. Outside in the night, the crowd had not dispersed. They chanted Naomi Brooks's name along with the phrase from the hearing, "Justice is not a joke." That sound followed Aisha's footsteps out of the building, echoing like a reminder that once truth is exposed, no force can stop its forward march. After days of media uproar filled with commentary, speculation, analysis, and no shortage of criticism, Victor Delaunay, the powerful man behind a web of multinational corporations, finally spoke. It wasn't a dry press release or a carefully crafted op-ed in a financial journal like usual. This time, he appeared live on national television, a surprising move from someone famously private, known for avoiding crowds and maintaining a demeanor so cold he was often referred to as the man in armor. The interview aired in the evening, when most viewers had finished their workday and tuned into news programs to catch up on current events. The studio was unusually quiet before the broadcast. Lighting was dimmed more than usual, creating a somber atmosphere, as if the space itself was holding its breath, waiting for answers from a figure both familiar and distant. Victor entered the studio in a charcoal gray suit, modest but crisp. His face lacked the usual steely expression seen at economic forums or on Forbes magazine covers. His eyes looked slightly tired, but not evasive. When the host asked why he had sided with Naomi Brooks during that pivotal moment at the hearing, Victor paused for several seconds. The room seemed to stop. He didn't rush. He looked down at his hands resting on his lap, then raised his head and spoke slowly. "My parents were Dutch immigrants. I grew up in a home constantly treated as foreign, and I've never forgotten what that feels like." The mood shifted instantly. A few whispers moved through the audience, but no one interrupted. The statement hadn't been scripted. It came with the weight of memory, and likely, Victor had never said it publicly before. The host looked momentarily surprised, but simply nodded and didn't interject. Victor continued, his voice steady and low, as if recounting a part of his life long buried. "I grew up in an old building near the docks, where people didn't need to ask your name to know your family didn't belong. My parents spoke Dutch at home, within 4 crumbling walls, but outside, they were silent. They spoke only when necessary, and always tried to pronounce every word perfectly. They didn't want their children to be targeted. And I, very early on, learned to hide my language, my roots, even my own voice." The man once described as a living calculator, now sat exposing childhood pain like an old scar that had never fully healed. "I got used to living in 2 worlds. One was family, a difference I never dared to name. The other was the society I had to adapt to in order to survive. Every time my parents accidentally spoke Dutch in public, I would shrink with fear, afraid someone would hear, afraid of being looked down on, afraid of being pushed away." He paused, took a deep breath as if steadying himself. Then, as he recalled the moment at the hearing, his gaze turned distant. That day, when Naomi stood up, with eyes sharp as blades, and spoke in flawless Dutch, it was as if my parents were finally being seen with dignity. She didn't lower her head, didn't hide. She stood in front of those trying to break her, and used the very language I had spent a lifetime hiding, like a shield. The sentence, "When I heard her speak my native language, I felt my roots were respected, carried heavy weight. It not only revealed why Victor's stance had changed, but touched a collective wound. The immigrants, the individuals who once had to pretend they were no different just to be accepted. On social media, the clip of that moment spread with lightning speed. Many cried when they heard his words. One person wrote, "For the first time, I felt my voice was acknowledged by someone at the top." Immigrant forums and minority community groups all shared the video clip without commentary, posting only the single quote, "I felt my roots were respected." One sentence, yet it cut deep, opening a door for millions to reflect on their own stories. While the outside world reacted in waves, Naomi sat in a small break room behind the kitchen of the restaurant where she still worked part-time. An old TV sat in the corner, casting a faded glow as Victor appeared on screen. She watched closely, saying nothing. When he spoke of his parents, of the fear that came with hiding one's voice, her eyes softened. She knew that feeling well. Pain doesn't come from being struck, but from being forced to abandon what makes you who you are. Naomi had once seen Victor as the face of coldness, but now, beneath the expensive suit, she saw a child who had lived in fear, just like her. The interview seemed ready to wrap with applause, but Victor wasn't finished. As the host began to move toward closing, he straightened, looked directly into the camera, and said, "I will personally fund a full academic scholarship for Naomi Brooks, so she can return to the education path she never should have had to abandon." The words landed like a strike through the room. The entire studio rose to their feet, applause roaring and unrelenting. This was no longer just sympathy, it was concrete action, a promise with real weight, coming from a man who wielded immense financial power. No one doubted he would follow through, because that was his way, direct, firm, and without delay. Within hours, headlines flooded every major outlet. Victor Delaunay announces full scholarship for Naomi Brooks. On social media, people began calling it the Justice Scholarship. Comments exploded exponentially. One post read, "Justice isn't just in the verdict, it's in the opportunities restored." Another said, "He used to represent a cold world, now he's using his power to heal. That gives me hope that change is real." The atmosphere on many university campuses began to shift. Students from minority communities started engaging in discussions about access to education and the talent often overlooked due to circumstance. One female student wrote on an academic forum, "I see myself in Naomi. I almost dropped out to care for my mother. Now I know, if someone believes in you enough to offer a chance, you can keep going." At the restaurant, a coworker handed Naomi a phone. Footage of Victor's broadcast was playing again, along with his statement about the scholarship. She froze. The cloth in her hand suddenly felt heavy. Her eyes trembled slightly, then closed, as if to hold back a wave of emotion. She didn't cry, but her eyes said everything. A faint smile crossed her face, a silent thank you. She had never dreamed that the chance to return to school would come back like this, from someone she had once thought was a stranger. International news outlets also reported on the story. One network called it an honorary scholarship, when empathy overcomes prejudice. The story became a source of inspiration, not just for its surprise, but for its message, that where you come from doesn't define your worth, and dreams should not be extinguished because of hardship. Naomi stepped outside after her shift, looking up at the night sky. The streetlight cast her shadow long across the pavement. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was walking alone. She carried not only her own hope, but the faith of an entire community that had long been forced into silence, and this time, they had been heard. While the public was still buzzing over the scholarship news, another announcement took everyone by surprise. In a press briefing, Victor Delaunay officially invited Naomi Brooks to become a language consultant for his corporation. The decision was not only symbolic but also practical, as Victor emphasized that Naomi's linguistic ability and composure were exactly what the company needed for its expansion projects in Europe. The news spread instantly. Dozens of articles reported that from being an invisible hotel janitor, Naomi had been offered a position within a professional circle, an unexpected reversal of status in just a matter of weeks. At the hotel where she still worked, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. Those who had once seen her as just another quiet coworker now looked at Naomi with entirely different eyes. One evening, as she entered the dining hall to clean up, a few fellow staff members paused their work, watching her. Not with mockery, but with genuine admiration. An older man who had worked at the hotel for over 10 years nodded and said, "We're proud of you." The simple sentence made Naomi stop in her tracks, then smile in return, her eyes lighting up for a brief moment. Naomi did not leave her current job immediately, but she knew her path had changed. Her co-workers' gazes reflected that transformation. No one saw her as just a cleaner anymore. They saw her as proof that every person holds hidden value. Younger janitorial staff, who had quietly endured disrespect, now began to believe they had the right to hope for something more. Naomi's presence in the break room was no longer ordinary. It had become a reminder that patience and resilience could rewrite a life. Beyond the hotel, The public response was explosive. Some commentators noted that Victor's decision to appoint Naomi was not merely an act of compassion, but a public statement that ability matters more than class prejudice. The media called it a reversal of power, where someone once humiliated was now invited to advise, while those who had belittled her faced disciplinary action. These articles continued to circulate widely, helping turn Naomi into a living symbol of change. Naomi, for her part, remained characteristically calm. When asked for her thoughts, she simply said she would do her best to contribute to the company, and that this opportunity wasn't just for her, but for anyone who had ever been overlooked, yet still believed in themselves. The quiet response earned praise across the community, as it proved Naomi hadn't changed who she was, even though her position had. She was still the quiet woman, only now, the light was finally shining where it had always deserved to. In the small break room, Naomi looked around at the co-workers now smiling at her. She knew her days as a janitor might soon come to an end, but in their admiring eyes, she saw a bond no title could erase. This was the place that had witnessed the days she was looked down on, and also the place that gave her the chance to prove her worth. Now that her position had changed, she wasn't walking away alone. She carried the pride and hope of an entire group that had learned to survive in silence. On Naomi Brooks's first day stepping into Victor's corporate conference room as a language consultant, the air shifted. That room, with its thick curtains, gleaming long table, and rows of high-end chairs, was the same one where she had once stood in the lowest position, cloth in hand, quietly cleaning amid snide laughter and cruel remarks. Now, that same room opened to her a completely different scene. There were no more looks of disdain, no mocking smiles. Instead, there was anticipation, attention, and even the hesitant gazes of people who had once seen her path. Naomi smiled soft, walking at a steady pace, heels clicking against the marble floor like steady declarations that the change was real and irreversible. In that moment, a young employee near the door whispered, "She's really different." But Naomi knew the difference wasn't in who she was. When invited to introduce herself to the senior leadership team, she paused, scanning the room that had once made her bow her head, and said with calm conviction, "I never changed my skin. The world changed how it sees it." The words echoed, soaking into every corner of the room, prompting even those at the head of the table to tilt their heads and listen. It wasn't just a personal truth. It was a reminder that transformation doesn't come from changing who you are, but from forcing the world to recognize your true worth. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of contempt like before, but one of reflection. A project director cleared his throat, then spoke up. "We look forward to learning from you." For the first time in that room, Naomi heard respect from people who had never once acknowledged her presence. She nodded, gaze steady, knowing that from this moment on, every word she spoke would carry weight, not just in her work, but for the entire community of people who had been labeled lesser. Outside, the media quickly covered Naomi's official start in her new role. They captured an image of her entering the boardroom, that faint smile still on her face, captioned, "From cleaning cloth to consultant's chair." Public response surged again, this time not with sympathy, pride. Long features praised her as a symbol of resolve, of staying true to oneself in the face of adversity. Service worker forums shared her quote, "I never changed my skin. The world changed how it sees it," like a declaration, turning it into a rallying cry for those still enduring injustice. At the hotel where Naomi once worked, a photo of her walking proudly out of the courthouse now hung in the staff break room. Next to it was a handwritten note from a co-worker. "She started from here." Other janitors, weary after long shifts, looked at the photo as a reminder that their job didn't define their dignity, and that anyone could change how the world sees them. A new female employee whispered to a friend, "Maybe next time a guest looks down on me, I'll think of Naomi to stay strong." In that way, Naomi had become a light for those who were still left behind. In the days that followed, Naomi took part in strategy meetings, translated documents, analyzed language patterns, and offered concrete suggestions to help the company expand into European markets. Her professionalism quickly shifted the minds of those who had doubted her at first. They no longer saw her through the lens of her past, but began to recognize her as a true colleague, a language expert with rare knowledge and skill. And Naomi, with her quiet presence, proved that status is not something granted. It is the result of undeniable value. Even so, Naomi kept her simple habits. She didn't forget to pass by the halls of the old hotel after work, sometimes stopping in to visit the co-workers still there, offering a few words of encouragement. They looked at her with respect, not because she had become a corporate advisor, but because she hadn't abandoned her roots. She was still Naomi Brooks, the one who once shared those silent cleaning shifts with them, the way she still shook each hand, still asked about their families, only deepened the admiration they felt. International media continued to praise Naomi, but she knew that every title meant nothing without responsibility. So, when asked how she felt after everything, Naomi replied simply, "I haven't changed. You were just forced to see me as I really am." The words left the audience in silence, then brought them to a wave of applause. Once again, Naomi made it clear her victory wasn't hers alone. It belonged to an entire community that had been hidden for too long. In the shadowed room where Naomi had once been the target of insults, she now stood and spoke truth, and everyone listened. And when she walked out, wearing a calm, confident smile unlike any she'd shown before, the world understood that a woman of color, with a janitor's background, had rewritten her story, not with a shout, but with quiet resolve and strength. "I haven't changed my skin. The world changed how it sees it." The words were no longer just Naomi's. They had become a truth that the whole society was now forced to face. Though her name had spread across the media and her image appeared on the front pages of major newspapers, Naomi Brooks continued living as simply as ever. That afternoon, in the small courtyard outside her worn-down rental apartment, she crouched beside the old car she had relied on for years. The car often gave her trouble, puffing smoke whenever it started, but Naomi had never thought of replacing it. To her, fixing it with her own hand, wiping grease from her fingers, kept her grounded in the life she still felt a part of. A small cloth was laid on the ground, a few tools placed beside her, and Naomi patiently loosened each bolt, cleaning each piece. The neighborhood kids, who were used to seeing her in her janitor's uniform, now watched with curiosity after the buzz of her TV appearances. They crept closer, then one of them suddenly blurted out a question that made Naomi pause. A little girl pointed to the slim silver ring on Naomi's hand, her eyes wide. "Miss, is that ring real?" The group giggled, their eyes innocent and eager. They had never seen someone from their poor neighborhood featured so widely in the media. Naomi looked up, her eyes soft and kind, then let out a quiet laugh. She took off the ring and handed it to the girl. "It's real, but not worth much. What matters isn't the ring, it's knowing how to hold on to it with your own hand." The children passed the ring around with awe, as if holding something precious. In their young eyes, Naomi saw a pure kind of admiration, one that came not from headlines or broadcasts, but from the everyday closeness they shared. A boy around 10, who often helped his mother sell snacks, hesitated before speaking. "I saw you on TV. You were talking to really important people. Weren't you scared?" Naomi set down her wrench, wiped her hands on the cloth, then smiled. "When you know you're not wrong, there's nothing to be afraid of." The simple answer made the group fall silent for a moment, as if thinking it through. Then another child shouted, "One day, I want to be like you. Not let anyone look down on me." The group burst into laughter, then ran around the courtyard, leaving Naomi with a warmth that spread through her chest. This quiet moment stood in sharp contrast to the days she had faced flashing lights and relentless questions from the press. Here, in the little yard, she found her balance again. Fame hadn't distanced her from her neighbors. Instead, it made the kids believe that someone from their own street could rise to the spotlight without losing their humility. Naomi bent back down, tightened another bolt, her smile still present, her heart lighter than ever. When the car finally rumbled back to life, the engine noisy but steady, Naomi exhaled with satisfaction. The kids clapped as if they had witnessed a miracle, then shouted in unison, "Miss Naomi, you're amazing." Naomi laughed and waved them off, but her eyes glowed with pride. She didn't need a grand stage or thunderous applause. Just the trust in those bright young eyes was enough to know she was on the right path. And in the late afternoon, with an old car and the sound of children's laughter echoing around her, Naomi had truly returned to the simple self she had always been. As the children continued passing the silver ring from hand to hand, their eyes sparkled as if they had just touched some great secret. Naomi Brooks sat down beside them and let out a gentle laugh. She reached out her slender hand, took the ring back, slipped it onto her finger, and spoke in a calm but clear voice that quieted them instantly. "It's just a keepsake. What matters is knowing how to stand up." The words sounded simple, yet left the small group silent and wide-eyed. A little girl clutching a worn-out school bag looked up at her, her round black eyes seeming to memorize every word. To them, the pale silver ring might have looked like a luxury, but Naomi had just shown them that true worth lies not in the object, but in the strength to hold oneself upright. The moment settled briefly, then the chatter picked up again. A skinny boy grinned and said loudly, "I want to have a keepsake too, so I can remember what I did." Naomi ruffled his hair gently, her gaze soft. "A keepsake doesn't have to be a ring or any object," she said. "Sometimes it's a memory, a lesson, or even a promise you make to yourself. What matters is keeping it in your heart." The children nodded, seeming to understand a part of her meaning, then broke into laughter again, running circles around the small courtyard as Naomi watched them with a quiet smile. Beside her, the old car engine ran smoothly again, its hum mixing with the sound of children's laughter, painting a simple yet warm picture in the late afternoon. Naomi leaned back in her seat and exhaled gently, feeling a rare sense of peace. She knew the world beyond still held storm, still harbored looks of contempt that had not fully disappeared, but in this moment, she had enough calm to smile. She remembered the long days spent hunched over in the hotel, wiping down tables as ridicule echoed behind her. Now, that all seemed to fade, replaced by laughter and the quiet kindness of a still evening. The western sky began to shift colors, the last light of day laying a soft, golden layer across the rooftops and over the small courtyard. Sunlight filtered through the trees, brushing Naomi's face and casting a warm metallic glow on her sun-browned skin. Everything around her seemed to be wrapped in a new light, still serene, so much so that it felt as though time itself might pause. Naomi looked up at the sky turning orange, her gaze distant, not sad, but filled with the calm of someone who had weathered storms and remained standing. A child ran over, tugged on the hem of her shirt, and asked innocently, "Miss, do you think we can stand up like you one day?" Naomi took the small hand in hers, gave it a gentle squeeze, and replied, "Of course. Standing up isn't just for some people. It's everyone's right, as long as you don't forget your worth." The boy nodded firmly, then ran back to join his friends, leaving Naomi with a satisfied smile. In that moment, she saw clearly that the road she had walked, the pain and hardship she had endured, had not been for nothing. It had become a mirror, a message for the next generation to hold their heads high. As the sun lowered, the whole neighborhood was bathed in a golden light like honey. The sound of traffic from the main road echoed faintly in the distance. But in the small courtyard, there were only the rustling of leaves and the cheerful voices of children. Naomi packed up her tools, wiped the grease from her hand, and then sat on an old wooden chair faded by time. She gazed at the sunset, her heart light, as if a great burden had just been lifted. Everything that had happened, from the humiliation in that luxurious room to the tense hearing, now felt like a film that had reached its end, leaving behind deep lessons, but also closing quietly behind her. The golden sunset covered everything: the old car, Naomi's face, and the children playing nearby. The scene was simple yet powerful, affirming that triumph doesn't only come from the bright lights of public attention, but also from the peace that comes with living true to one's values. Naomi smiled gently and looked into the distance. In her heart, a quiet voice echoed. The world had changed how it looked, but it was her resolve forced it to. And in the final light of day, that smile glowed, becoming proof of one unchanging truth: dignity, when held firm, will always shine, no matter where you are. That afternoon, as the fading sun pulled away from rooftops and the narrow streets sank into stillness, Naomi Brooks unexpectedly heard a soft knock at the door. She hesitated for a few seconds before opening it, and standing on the porch was Marcus Hale, the man who had witnessed everything in that hotel room. Gone was the arrogant figure in the polished suit. Today, Marcus wore simple clothes, his face marked with exhaustion and his eyes heavy. He bowed his head and almost whispered, "I was wrong the moment I opened my mouth." The words were brief, but landed like a sigh that had been held in for far too long. Naomi looked at him, neither surprised nor quick to respond. She stood still for a moment, then stepped aside so Marcus could enter the small room. He sat on an old wooden chair, his hands clasped, back slightly hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. After a few seconds of silence, Naomi finally spoke, slowly but firmly. "You failed me, and you failed your own dignity." The reply made Marcus lift his head, his eyes faintly trembling, because he knew she had touched the deepest truth. He took a deep breath, and admitted that, on that day in the luxury room, he had watched the humiliation unfold as if it were a form of entertainment. He hadn't laughed out loud, but his condescending gaze and silence made him complicit. Marcus confessed, "I thought I was innocent, that only the ones who spoke were guilty, but my silence was worse, because it allowed those words to echo." Naomi nodded slightly, neither dismissing nor immediately forgiving, because she knew Marcus needed to hear the truth from his own mouth. The conversation unfolded in the small space, heavy with weight. Marcus shared that since the incident spread, he had been haunted by the image of Naomi holding her head high in the face of public scrutiny. He read the news, saw millions calling her name, while his faded into the list of those who said nothing. "I used to be proud of my detachment," he sighed, "but now I see it was cowardice dressed in power." Naomi listened, her expression mostly unchanged, but inside she felt the genuine struggle in his every word. When Marcus hesitantly asked if Naomi could forgive him, she didn't offer an easy answer. She said, "Forgiveness isn't a gift I can hand out in one afternoon. It's a process you have to walk through yourself. Forgiveness only matters if you change how you see and act, not if you say a few words and walk away." Marcus bowed his head, his hands clenched so tightly the knuckles turned white. He knew she was right, that an apology only holds value when backed by long-term action. Even so, the meeting wasn't meaningless. Naomi, after everything, still gave Marcus the chance to face himself. She added, "You didn't just fail me, you failed every person who who was disrespected while you chose not to speak up. If you want redemption, start there. That message was a door slightly opened, helping Marcus see that change doesn't come from apologizing to one person, but from learning to stand on the side of justice instead of hiding in the safety of silence. As Marcus stood up to leave, the sunset beyond the window had turned a deep shade of orange-red, casting his limping figure clearly as he stepped down the porch. Naomi nodded in farewell, saying nothing more, but it was enough for him to know that his journey toward redemption had only just begun. Inside Naomi, there was no sense of triumph, only a quiet relief at seeing someone brave enough to face himself, even if it came late. And for Marcus, today's confession, though delayed, was still the first step in reclaiming the dignity he had lost in a moment that once seemed harmless. That evening, Naomi sat alone in the quiet room. She thought about those who had chosen silence, and understood that silence could sometimes cut deeper than cruelty. But she also knew that if someone like Marcus could come forward and admit his wrongs, there was still hope for change. The sunset faded, but within Naomi, another door opened, one where justice was not only about punishment, but also about offering people the chance to become better versions of themselves. Marcus Hale stood still at the threshold after leaving Naomi Brooks's small room. His shadow stretched across the narrow street, the last light of day falling in soft, blurry streaks. The man, once used to leather chairs and elegant conference rooms, now carried a heavy posture, shoulders bent, as if every step forward was a silent confession. He stood frozen, his face stripped of the usual confidence, no trace left of the millionaire who once commanded every conversation. In the stillness, he seemed like a misplaced shadow, each footstep echoing the emptiness he now carried inside. Naomi stood under the porch, watching without another word. She didn't see victory in the scene before her, only a man confronting the weakest parts of his own humanity. Marcus paused a few times, as if tempted to turn back, but continued walking, his head bowed. The last traces of sunlight shimmered across his graying hair, revealing an age he once masked behind expensive suits. In Naomi's eyes, that silence mattered more than any justification, because it showed he had nothing left to lean on except the honesty of facing his own conscience. The road leading to the main street, usually filled with noise, was strangely quiet now. The small houses were still, only a few windows cracked open to spill out warm yellow light. Marcus walked through that space, wrapped in silence thick as a heavy curtain, making even his breath feel uneasy. He recalled every moment in the hotel conference room when he chose silence and let the humiliation fall on Naomi. The memory returned with such clarity that it felt like he was still there, arms folded, watching someone else be cornered. That image drained him, each step dragging behind it a growing weight of regret. Naomi closed the door behind her, leaving Marcus alone in the darkness that was slowly settling in. She didn't want to witness anything more, as everything that needed to be said had been said, and the rest was his to face. Inside, Naomi sat down at the wooden table, her heart quiet. She understood that the silence on that road enveloped not only Marcus, but also her own memories, the days she was dismissed, the complicit gazes that watched but never intervened. Meanwhile, Marcus kept walking, his shoes tapping softly against the old tiles, blending with the sound of the wind blowing through the street. He was no longer the millionaire from lavish parties, no longer the face seen in financial magazines, but merely a man trying to make peace with himself. He quietly recalled the times he had spoken so proudly about power and control, only to realize now that power could never hide the cowardice of standing silent in the face of justice. People in the neighborhood watched him pass, but no one spoke. They saw a man walking by, his posture far removed from the wealth he once flaunted. Their silence, too, became part of the scene, making the road feel even heavier. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, not with scorn, nor pity, but as a quiet reminder that he had lost the most valuable thing, the respect of the community. His steps finally led him to an intersection, where the streetlights had just flickered on, casting a pale, sparse glow. Marcus stopped, looking up at the sky now darkened, the last streaks of light fading behind the low building. He suddenly felt that silence was not only cloaking the street, but also his heart. It wasn't a peaceful silence, but a probing one, an emptiness that demanded to be filled through change. He knew that if he continued to remain silent, his life would become nothing more than a faint replica of past mistakes. But if he began to speak and act rightly, perhaps there was still a chance to redeem even a part of it. In that moment, Marcus no longer thought of assets, deals, or reputation. All of it felt meaningless next to Naomi's calm gaze and steady voice. He realized that her silence carried more strength than all the applause he had ever received in grand halls. And as he turned and kept walking, silence still covered the street, as if accompanying him on a journey to reclaim the dignity he had long forgotten. Naomi, inside her home, sat watching the streetlights spill through the window. She knew Marcus would carry that silence as a burden, but she also hoped it would become the force that drove him to change. For her, today's encounter closed with an open ending, not total forgiveness, but a reminder that anyone can choose how they walk forward. And out there, as night slowly blanketed the streets, silence still cloaked every corner, standing as proof that sometimes silence is the loudest bell, forcing people to truly hear themselves. One weekend morning, while the media still followed Naomi Brooks's every move, the Roe Corporation unexpectedly held a major press conference. On stage, the CEO announced the creation of a special scholarship fund named after Naomi Brooks. He emphasized that this was not just a tribute to an individual who had inspired many, but also a commitment to nurturing the unfinished dreams of people once dismissed because of their skin color or occupation. The scholarship would support students in linguistics, sociology, and underprivileged students, giving them the chance to pursue the education Naomi once had to abandon. The news spread quickly, moving many to tears. The image of Naomi sitting quietly in the audience, eyes brimming as her name was called, became a symbol of dignity and unwavering strength. Public response embraced the news as a gift. Educational forums immediately launched discussions about the value of scholarships, and many teachers wrote that naming the fund after Naomi was a way to acknowledge the true worth of laborers who had contributed to society, but were often forgotten. Immigrant working-class families expressed hope that their children might find opportunity through the very fund Naomi had inspired. A major newspaper ran the headline, "From Cleaning Rag to Scholarly Legacy, Naomi Brooks becomes an educational icon." Society now saw her story as no longer limited to the hotel incident, but as a foundation for lasting change. Meanwhile, the police department could no longer remain on the sideline. After a series of scandals, disciplinary rulings, and mounting public pressure, a wave of reforms was announced. City officials issued a directive requiring all new officers to undergo human rights and equality training before assuming their duties. In this special course, the video of Naomi answering the phone in Dutch and being humiliated was used as a case study. Officers were required to discuss the wrongdoing, analyze the abuse of authority, and learn how to handle such situations with respect. Instructors emphasized that human rights were not an abstract theory, but began with how each officer treated a citizen standing right in front of them. Many saw this as a long overdue but necessary step. News reports included commentary such as, "If the system had learned this lesson earlier, Naomi wouldn't have had to stand alone in that luxurious room." Social activists called the new training program a sign of change at the roots, even as much work remained. But for the community, the fact that the clip, which once caused Naomi so much pain, was now used to educate a new generation of officers, felt like justice of another kind. It turned a wound into a lesson and transformed humiliation into strength. Naomi followed the news from a distance, offering few public comments. When asked how she felt, she simply smiled and said, "If my story helps someone get an education or be treated with respect, then everything I went through was worth it." That brief response once again moved the public, showing the humility and depth in how Naomi viewed her journey. She didn't see herself as a hero, but rather as one link in a much larger shift, where thousands joined hands to make society less unjust. On social media, many young people shared images of Naomi beside the scholarship fund's slogan, using it as personal motivation. One student wrote, "I'm studying linguistics, and I know I can keep going because Naomi cleared the path." A parent commented, "My child will grow up in a society where police have to learn about human rights. That used to feel impossible." These messages showed that her story's impact had stretched beyond a single city, becoming a lasting source of inspiration. As evening settled, Naomi sat alone in the small yard, watching the last sunlight turn the row of modest houses gold. She gently touched the silver ring on her finger, a reminder that everything began with small moments. From holding on to dignity in that hotel room, to speaking in someone else's mother tongue, to enduring insults, her legacy was no longer hers alone. It now belonged to anyone who believed that truth and justice would eventually find their place. And in the quiet of sunset, Naomi understood. Her journey wasn't over, but it had laid the foundation for future generations to keep writing their stories with courage and conviction. Since the Naomi Brooks Scholarship Fund was announced and the new police human rights training launched, public discussion hadn't slowed. At community gatherings, people brought up the image of the empty street Marcus Hale walked in silence, calling it a vivid example of change. An elderly neighbor told a reporter, "One quiet street changed the whole system." The phrase quickly spread, summing up the entire journey, from oppressive silence to a wave of reform. People realized that sometimes, it's not the shouts in the square, but the quiet reckoning of one person facing their failure that can shake a society. That street, once as ordinary as any other, had become become etched in collective memory as a symbol of a turning point. In television discussion, commentators used the phrase to explore social transformation. They argued that "one quiet street" referred not only to the moment Marcus bowed his head, but also to the years Naomi silently endured, walking luxury hallways with a mop in hand while no one looked her way. That solitude, once revealed, became the spark that made society reconsider how it treats those it overlooks. And now, people look back and see, from that silence, justice found its strength. Despite becoming the focus of countless news stories, Naomi still chose to live a simple life. She declined invitations to glamorous galas and rarely appeared at media events. Instead, she spent time in her small neighborhood, with the children who used to watch her fix her old car, and with the language consulting work Delaunay had offered her. Each morning, Naomi still went to the market like everyone else, picking vegetables, bargaining with the elderly vendor, then returning to her small apartment with a calm demeanor. Locals who saw her often wanted to approach for a photo, but Naomi usually just smiled and nodded, keeping her distance from the spotlight that she never felt belonged to her. When a reporter once asked why she didn't use her fame to build a bigger public image, Naomi gently replied, "I want to live as I always have, to remember that everything began with simplicity." That answer moved many, because in an age where people often turn tragedy into a tool for attention, Naomi chose to return to everyday life. She preserved her authenticity, refusing to be swept up by public attention, and that very choice only earned her greater respect. Former colleagues at the hotel, whenever they happened to see Naomi again, would tell each other that they didn't just see a corporate language consultant, but the same woman who once quietly wiped down every table without complaint. Naomi's simplicity reminded them that true worth doesn't come from status, but from how one chooses to live after enduring the storm. Many began to quietly follow her example, staying calm in their work and treating each other with more kindness. One late afternoon, Naomi walked down the same road tied to Marcus's story. Golden sunlight stretched across the pavement, and a soft breeze carried the scent of flowers from nearby gardens. Locals saw her pass by, smiling and greeting her, and some quietly repeated, "One quiet street changed the whole system." Naomi just smiled, saying nothing, but inside, she knew her greatest legacy wasn't the scholarship or the reforms enacted, but the awakening in people's hearts. That awakening was what would truly endure, far beyond any title or recognition. That evening, Naomi cooked herself a simple meal, then sat by the window looking out at the streetlights. She didn't need praise, because simplicity was the anchor that kept her grounded amid the noise. She knew her journey had left a deep mark on society, but for her personally, the greatest reward was living in peace, continuing her work, and preserving the wholeness of her spirit. And in the quiet of her small room, Naomi felt at ease, knowing that her choice to live simply had preserved the legacy, like the sunset once casting its golden light over the small street, silent but never fading. The story of Naomi Brooks has traveled a long road, from what seemed like an ordinary afternoon in a luxury hotel to becoming a social movement that forced an entire system to change. The narrator closes this journey with a simple yet profound reflection. Justice does not emerge from grand gestures, but begins with small actions. A woman patiently preserving her dignity amid humiliation, a single phrase spoken in a foreign language in a moment of disregard, or even just the quiet strength to stand firm under scornful gazes. These are all seeds. And when nurtured with enough patience and courage, those seeds grow into trees that can shelter entire communities. Justice is not granted from above, but shaped by what seem like small choices made by individuals. The silver ring on Naomi's hand, once admired by the neighborhood children, was just an ordinary keepsake. It held no material power to alter her fate, but the way Naomi looked at it transformed it into a symbol. The ring revealed a truth, that people often seek meaning in simple things, but that meaning becomes real only when upheld by the strength of character. Naomi once said, "It's just a keepsake. What matters is that we know how to stand up." And that is the final reminder. Material things may attract attention, but only resolve and perseverance bring real justice. It was that resolve that kept Naomi from falling when mocked by an officer, that let her calmly respond in Dutch, and that ultimately forced society to look inward. The final lesson this story offers is not about one person becoming a symbol, but about how the determination of an ordinary individual can ripple outward and touch the hearts of millions. Justice is not a spotlight shining on a stage, but the small rays of light slipping through a crack in the door, gathering until they become dawn. Naomi proved that even in places no one is watching, the right action can illuminate a path toward change. And if each person holds on to their courage in their own moment, society need not wait for distant heroes, because we ourselves are the foundation of justice. In the eyes of everyday people, Naomi's story did not end with a verdict or a headline. It ended in the way they came to understand that silence in the face of injustice is a form of complicity, and that anyone anyone, no matter their position, can become the starting point of change. Justice does not appear through dazzling slogans, but through the courage to speak out, to hold on to dignity, and to keep walking the right path, even when walking alone. Naomi took that path, and from her initial solitude, she compelled the entire system to follow. That stands as powerful proof personal courage can give rise to collective justice. As it draws to a close, the lesson resonates like a quiet reminder. Do not seek justice in objects or titles, but in courage and small daily actions. A ring may illuminate a story, but only resolution can keep that light alive. Naomi Brooks did not change the world with wealth or status, but by holding on to the truth, turning humiliation into evidence, and transforming calmness into a guiding light. Because of that, her story is not just a memory of a single moment, but a living legacy, one that reminds anyone who recalls it that we all have a duty to live with integrity, to stand up when needed, and to protect human dignity as the firmest foundation of justice. The story does not end within the bounds of one person, but expands into a mirror that forces society to reflect. As the videos, testimony, and the image of Naomi Brooks walking out of the courtroom with her head held high were shared widely, people from many walks of life began asking themselves, how many times had they also stayed silent in the face of injustice? How often had they let mockery or prejudice pass without objection? The event became a mirror, revealing not only the failures of the police or those in power, but also the invisible complicity of the community through its silence. The narrator emphasizes that when society finally looks in the mirror, the goal is not to assign blame, but to learn how to change and avoid repeating the same path. Public discussions emerged everywhere, from university lecture halls to community gatherings. Educators asked students, if you were Naomi that day, what would you have done? If you were a bystander, would you have spoken up? These questions led young people to think deeply about civic responsibility, while older generations recalled moments when they witnessed injustice but turned away. In facing these truths, society began to understand that justice is not an abstract concept. It is tied to every choice made in daily life. Across the media, one striking headline spread widely: "Justice is never lost. It shines when least expected." That phrase not only captured Naomi's journey, but served as a message that even when injustice drags on, truth will eventually find a way to surface. People cited Naomi as proof that justice can flare up from what seems like a small act, a phone call answered in Dutch, a calm lift of the head, but its ripple effect can shake an entire system. It helped many realize that justice is never gone, only waiting for the right moment and the right courage to emerge. In discussion forums, scholars quoted that line as a guiding principle. They argued that society often chases justice in distant places when it is already within reach, in the hands of each individual. Courage does not lie in changing the world overnight, but in standing tall when the world tries to make you bow. And when one person dares to act, millions more will see, feel, and follow. That is how justice finds its way back, even in the moments no one expects. Naomi, after everything, did not reappear in a glamorous image. She continued living in the small neighborhood, keeping her simple habits, sometimes just quietly watching the sunset. But it was this calmness that highlighted the message she left behind. People realized that justice does not come from dazzling title, but from unwavering perseverance. She did not change her skin color, nor her roots, but it was the world that was forced to change how it looked at her. That too became a lesson for society to reflect on itself. Justice will shine, but only when people are brave enough to face the truth. As other stories continued to surface in society, people still looked to Naomi as a standard of comparison. Journalists wrote that from now on, anyone witnessing injustice could no longer claim not to know what to do, because Naomi had shown the way. Human rights organizations considered the case a prime example, integrating it into training materials so that future generations would understand that justice can be hidden but never disappears. It will shine at the right moment, when least expected, and that light is powerful enough to illuminate a path for an entire society to change. The narrator concluded that it was society's act of looking in the mirror that formed the lasting legacy. Not the scholarship fund, not the policy reform, but the shift in collective awareness is what will endure. That mirror is not for admiring oneself, but for self-questioning. Are we living justly with others, or allowing injustice to persist? And the answer, if honest enough, will become the guiding light for the future. Because, as the phrase now etched in the memory of millions says, justice is never lost. It shines when least expected. The story of Naomi Brooks began in what seemed a small setting, a lavish conference room, where men in police uniforms and and tailored suits treated the humiliation of a black cleaning woman as entertainment. Few could have predicted that from that moment, a chain of events would unfold, forcing an entire society to pause and look in the mirror to question itself. Naomi did not scream or lash out. She did something ordinary. She picked up the phone and spoke fluent Dutch. That simple act became the spark that ignited a collapse of an attitude once thought untouchable. When public attention started to rise, many believed the story would soon fade like other viral storms. But Naomi's calmness, combined with the way society responded, turned it into a turning point. Video clips of the hotel incident spread everywhere. The mocking words of Officer Grant and Officer Doyle were exposed, and the indifference of Marcus Hale, the millionaire who once treated it all as amusement, became a symbol of dangerous complicity. The public gradually realized that this was no longer just a personal incident, but a mirror, reflecting a system that had long enabled contempt to exist. Naomi did not seek attention. She continued working, kept her life simple, but it was that calmness that made her the center of a growing wave of support. People began sharing their own stories, the times they were looked down on because of their skin color, their job, their background. These stories flowed like an underground current, adding strength to Naomi. The more people spoke up, the harder the truth became to deny. Human rights organizations got involved, international media followed closely, and the authorities were forced to launch a full investigation. The investigation uncovered internal emails filled with derogatory language, proving that the actions of Grant and Doyle were not impulsive, but the product of long-standing prejudice. Naomi was called to testify, and her statement, paired with the video footage, became undeniable evidence. The hearing was tense, but the turning point came when Naomi stood and said calmly, "A joke never stops the bleeding of generations oppressed." That sentence turned the hearing into a historic moment, leaving society stunned and reflective. The final ruling suspended Grant and Doyle and imposed heavy disciplinary measures. The hotel, which had once turned a blind eye, was also forced to issue a public apology, but justice did not stop there. Victor Delaunay, the millionaire who had initially seemed indifferent, confessed his past, speaking of his Dutch immigrant parents and how he felt shame when hearing them speak their native language. That memory stirred empathy in him toward Naomi. He then publicly funded a scholarship so Naomi could resume the academic path she had left behind, and even invited her to become a language advisor for his corporation. That decision was not just personal, but a declaration that talent and dignity deserved to be placed in the right position. The public was moved by Victor's gesture, but what truly stirred society was how Naomi received it. She did not turn herself into a glamorous figure, nor did she use her fame to gain power. Naomi still went to the market, still fixed her old car in the small yard, still talked to neighborhood kids with her gentle smile. These seemingly simple moments became the true source of her strength. People saw in her the proof that worth does not come from the spotlight, but from living faithfully to oneself. When the Rowe Corporation announced the scholarship fund named after Naomi, when authorities required new officers to study human rights, and when advocacy groups incorporated her story into training materials, it became clear that her legacy had far outgrown the individual. It was no longer just the story of a cleaning woman, but a warning to every power structure. Silence in the face of injustice is what allows injustice to grow. People in Naomi's neighborhood often repeated the phrase, "A quiet street changed the whole system." The image of Marcus Hale walking away silently after his late confession became a symbol that sometimes silence itself can be the loudest accusation. The greatest lesson from this journey is that justice is not distant or abstract. It begins with small acts, like a calm response, a lifted head with a quiet smile, the choice not to bow under humiliation. The silver ring on Naomi's finger once sparked curiosity among the neighborhood kids, but she said, "It's just a keepsake. What matters is that we know how to stand up." The ring merely revealed the truth, but it was the resolve that created justice. It's a reminder to everyone that our dignity is not defined by how others see us, but by how we choose to move forward. From a societal perspective, Naomi's story made the entire community look in the mirror. Each person began to ask, how many times have I stayed silent in the face of injustice? How often have I dismissed contempt as something trivial? And through that self-reflection, real change began. Because justice doesn't disappear, it only waits for the right moment to shine, usually when least expected. In that journey, Naomi didn't become a distant hero, but remained a humble woman living her everyday life. And that made her legacy more enduring, because it was rooted in reality. Every action she took reminded people that change doesn't lie in the hands of the extraordinary, but in each of us, when we choose to hold our ground at the critical moment. The storyteller concludes that the most valuable thing Naomi left behind isn't the scholarship, nor the policy reform, but a guiding light for the collective conscience. It reminds us that justice isn't granted from above, it's created by ordinary people who choose to do what's right. A single word, a glance, a small action can become the start of change across an entire system. Naomi Brooks proved that no matter where you stand in society, dignity is an asset that can never be taken away. And by holding on to it, you not only protect yourself, but can spark a change that reaches far beyond you. That is the legacy she leaves behind. A reminder that justice may be hidden, but it never disappears. It will shine again, at the right time, in the right place, reminding us that we are only truly free when we respect one another's humanity.